I'd like to call today's hearing to order. This is going to be a hearing on the FY 2013 budget request for EPA. We only have one witness today, and that's the Honorable Lisa Jackson, who's Administrator of EPA. And Ms. Bennett is there to provide additional information if she needs it, which she probably won't, but we're delighted to have you here as well. And I'm going to recognize myself for 3 minutes for the purpose of making an opening statement. This is a joint hearing of the Energy and Power and the Environment and Economy subcommittees of the Energy and Commerce Committee. And I think it is important that we have this hearing because in Washington it seems like we do become anesthetized to dollar amounts. And when we go home and we attend civic clubs and have town hall meetings, people inevitably get upset about the many dollars that are being spent in Washington, D.C. President Obama's FY13 budget request is for $3.7 trillion, and in that there are $350 billion in new program requests or new initiatives. We're going to be focused only on the budget of EPA, and the EPA FY13 budget request is $8.3 billion. And that's less than last year, and certainly that's moving in the right direction. I might add that I think all government agencies at this particular time, when we have a $16 trillion federal debt, do have to be cognizant and aware of how we're spending these dollars. And as a result of that, I might just pat Congress on the back because last year, FY12, Congress reduced its own budget by 6.4%, and we anticipate that our budget this year is going to be reduced by an equal amount or very close to it. And so on that front, I know EPA's budget request for 2013 is 1.2% less than last year, so I'm going to urge them to try to be more like Congress on being prudent with these dollars. But we look forward to this hearing. It is very important, and we look forward to exploring in more details the 5 specific goals that EPA has set out for FY13. So with that, I would like to recognize the ranking member of the Energy and Power Subcommittee, Mr. Rush, for 3 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Administrator, for being here today, and I want to thank you for all your hard work, your exceeding dedication on behalf of the American people to protect the public health. I do not envy your task in trying to do your job and trying to protect the nation's air and water supply when I understand that the President's FY13 EPA budget calls for $105 million less than the $8.4 billion that Congress appropriated to the agency last year. And on top of these budgetary restraints, you've got to deal with the constant partisan demonizing that's going on in this Congress about the work that your agency does so valiantly in protecting our nation's most vulnerable population. Madam Administrator, I want to just commend the EPA on your recently issued mercury and air toxic standards, the first national standards to protect Americans' families from power plant emissions of mercury and other toxic air pollutants like arsenic and acid gas. These rules will protect millions of vulnerable children and millions of families from harmful and costly air pollution and provide the American people with health benefits that far outweigh the cost of compliance. It must be noted that the EPA worked extensively with stakeholders, including industry and others, to minimize costs and maximize flexibility before finalizing these standards. And I would also note that, as you predicted, Madam Administrator, some companies are already scaling back their estimated compliance costs as a result of the MATS standard. While the MATS rule and other environmental regulations have been blamed for potentially causing wide-scale plant retirements, upon careful notice, we see the limited facilities that are indeed being retired are among the oldest and the dirtiest and the most inefficient facilities that are no longer economically feasible in light of cheaper and abundant supplies of natural gas and low energy demand. So, Madam Administrator, I strongly support the work you're doing. I look forward to your testimony today, and I congratulate you for being at the helm of one of the better agencies in the government and for the work that your agency does. Thank you. And I yield back my time.
Yeah. You'll notice that our clock's not working up on the wall.
Oh, I still got some time left.
And they are in the process of fixing that, but in the meantime, we do have this one that's working. And at this time, I recognize the chairman of the Environment and Economy Subcommittee, Mr. Shimkus, 3 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just note for my colleagues that the green light does go on and the yellow does go on when you're getting close to time. So the numbers aren't, but the lights are working. So, and I would just like to welcome the administrator and to my friend, Mr. Rush. Good thing we have drilling and fracking to recover all that natural gas that's going to help us move to a cleaner future. Without that, we couldn't access these natural gas reserves, and I hope that the administration, with newfound love for natural gas, will not inhibit drilling, fracking, and also regulate the flaring issues to try to stop the natural gas. Your request is for $8.3 billion to fund the EPA in 2013. I've been quoted saying we wanted to go as a committee line by line, and unfortunately, the documents that we've been provided so far doesn't give us a lot of detail about where the money is planned to go and how it's to be spent. So hopefully this hearing will help us flush some of that out, and hopefully the follow-up documents that we request will provide it so we can have an analysis of where the money you're requesting is actually designed and destined to go. Based upon what I see, only about 1% less spending is proposed from last year. With such a minimum decrease from an agency whose funding has skyrocketed under this administration, I have concerns we are not committing our maximum effort towards scaling back wasteful spending. Whether it is clean air, drinking water, solid waste disposal act, or Superfund, all these programs deserve a complete review, and I hope this administration is committed to working with us to promote a transparent look into where, by statute, the dollars and cents flow at the EPA. This help will go a long way towards assisting our efforts to give confidence to the American public that we are protecting human health and the environment, trimming unnecessary spending where appropriate, and eliminating duplicative programs. Equally as important as the money we are spending is leftover money we are not spending. In this case, I'm referring to the billions of dollars the EPA has that it will carry over from prior year appropriations, about $3.3 billion, some of it not obligated. And the question is, why can we only find $100 million in savings when we have billions of dollars that are not spent in this current year? That's not talking about the billions not spent in the obligated funds. Rather than sitting on these funds, EPA should bring down spending requests in its budget or work to spend down these funds in areas where it makes sense. Lastly, activities by this agency, both regulatory and non-regulatory, incur public and private costs. This committee needs to know what all EPA activity is costing taxpayers directly from funding we authorize and appropriate in Congress. Even more important, especially during these economic times, is what those actions could mean in terms of jobs and the economy. Our economy continues to struggle, and one of the fastest ways for us to get back on course is providing common sense regulatory certainty by eliminating unnecessary burdensome regulations. This will spark American job creators and help develop the conditions essential for economic growth and job creation in the United States. These companies want to stay here or come back need to be assured that we understand how to balance oversight and public health regulation with innovation and growth. Again, I do appreciate Administrator Jackson being here today as we move forward on this budget. I look forward to having an open dialogue, and we'll see how today goes. Thank you for coming.
This time I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, who's ranking member of the Environment and Economy Subcommittee, for 3 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. By not having the lights, I thought maybe we had changed the rules to allow us to go under Senate rules, so where we could make these hearings last all day. I'm sure our administrator would love that. I want to thank you for holding this important hearing on the EPA's 2013 budget request. One, it takes care of our jurisdiction with our committee that all of us are concerned about in the oversight of EPA. This year, the administration and Congress will once again be forced to make some tough choices when it comes to our budget. The task of choosing which programs to fund is an inevitable position, and I understand it's not an easy task. I've reviewed the EPA's request, and I must say I'm extremely concerned and disheartened by the decision to fund many of their programs by drastically cutting the funding for the Superfund program and the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. Our 29th district in Houston, we have 2 Superfund sites that are in close proximity to our district, the San Jacinto Waste Pits and U.S. Oil Recovery. San Jacinto Waste Pits was added to the National Priorities List in 2008. The EPA has been conducting studies and begun the very early stages of the cleaning up the site. The U.S. Oil Recovery site was listed as a proposed addition to the National Priority List in 2011. From what I've witnessed at the San Jacinto Waste Pits, I believe the EPA is making great strides in the Superfund program. Yet at $1.176 billion, the Superfund's request for 2013 is the lowest request for the program in the last 10 years. According to EPA's congressional justification, this funding level is so low it would not allow for any new construction projects in FY13 and would constrain new construction projects in FY12. My fear, which I think is very clearly shown in the administration's budget, is Superfund sites and other Superfund sites across the country will be abandoned and left to contaminate our environment or left for our state agencies to remediate. In 2011, only 11 new sites were proposed for inclusion on the National Priorities List, but 15 were added and only 7 were deleted. These small numbers, and even if they are improvement over the past years, the EPA can still do better and should be placing a priority on a very long list of Superfund sites that continue to be cleaned up, even if the EPA does not request the funds. And I hope other members with Superfund sites in their districts will share my concern with the massive cut in Superfund. I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. Thank you. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton, for 3 minutes for an opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, could I defer for a few minutes? I want to give it. I just got through with the doctor's office, and I want to get collected before I.
But you do want to talk later.
I do, but if you could let somebody else go.
Mr. Waxman's been very courteous and said he's willing to go now. So I'd like to recognize Mr. Waxman from California for a 3-minute opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator Jackson, thank you for being here today, and thank you for your outstanding leadership that you've provided to the Environmental Protection Agency. Under your leadership, EPA is making our air safer to breathe and our water safer to drink, and you are doing so in a way that will strengthen our economy and create jobs. Congress should be your partner in these efforts. But since Republicans took control last January, the House of Representatives has tried to undermine your efforts every step of the way. The EPA budget represents a small portion of the overall federal spending. Under the President's proposal for fiscal year 2013, EPA funding would be less than 1/4% of the federal budget, and EPA would share over 40% of these funds with the states and tribes to help implement federal environmental laws and achieve national goals. But today we'll hear that your budget is too big. We will be told that we can't afford investing in clean air and clean water. These attacks are really part of a broader agenda. This has been the most anti-environmental House of Representatives in history. House Republicans have voted over 200 times to undermine basic environmental protections that have existed for decades. They have voted to block actions to prevent air pollution, to strip the EPA of authority to enforce water pollution standards, to halt efforts to address climate change. Cutting EPA's funding is just another way to limit the agency's effectiveness. This is an extreme agenda. American families want clean air and they want clean water. They don't want their health put at risk by exposure to toxic chemicals. They understand that stalling action on climate change means more intense and frequent heat waves, more droughts, more flooding, more loss of coastline. According to the IEA, delaying action until the end of the decade will quadruple the cost of the global economy. They understand inadequately funding cleanups of Superfund sites will increase their complexity and costs. 1/4% of our budget is not too much to spend on clean air and clean water and a healthy environment. In fact, I believe it may not be enough. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Barton. Are you ready now?
I'm ready.
The gentleman from Texas recognized for 3 minutes for an opening statement.
Well, thank you. I want to give the administrator an A for attendance at our hearings. She's always been gracious about appearing. I cannot give you an A for your performance because I think you've tended to evade some of our more direct questions, but we do appreciate your attitude and willingness to appear before us. Today, Chairman Whitfield and Chairman Shimkus and their two subcommittees are going to conduct a hearing on the EPA's 2013 EPA budget. EPA has over 17,000 employees. They have a budget over $8 billion. You would think that with that much manpower and that many dollars, they'd be able to answer some of the questions that this Congress and this committee and this subcommittee has been asking them for the past year. You have to comply with the President's Executive Order 13563, which require that regulations promote economic growth, innovation, competitiveness, and job creation. That order further requires the federal agencies to employ, and I want to highlight, the least burdensome tool for achieving regulatory ends, taking into account benefits and costs, both quantitative and qualitative. Repeatedly, the EPA, under your direction, has said that they don't have to comply with this executive order or have done so in a most perfunctory way. This committee has written letters requesting specific health benefit and monetary losses and gains from each and every regulation that you've proposed. These, to the extent that you have attempted, your administration has attempted to answer these letters, they've been evasive and have not responded to the specific request. In terms of the science and research funding and support activities, such as quality assurance, supervisory budget, and things of this sort, your agency has been funding research with grants to people who serve on the review committees. Is this a conflict of interest? Almost every single member of the Clean Air Science Advisory Committee has been directly or indirectly funded for research. This would be similar to myself counting my votes for my reelection. It wouldn't be a surprise if I won if I'm counting the votes. These members that serve on these advisory panels are often asked to review other research that they themselves were a party to or were on the original research team. Is this the only way and the best way to do so-called peer review? There is a manual called the Reference Manual on Scientific Evidence. This is published by the Federal Judicial Center as a guide to research for the reasons to propose new regulations. These guidelines are followed by the world's leading toxicologists and epidemiologists on how to study the health effects for pollution. Your agencies refuse to follow some of the basic standards in this manual. For example, it requires that you would justify your studies to be unbiased and not include so-called confounding factors. A confounding factor is when another causal factor confuses the relationship between the agent of interest and the outcome of interest, such as the utilization of particulate matter PM2.5 instead of mercury to justify the utility mercury air toxic standard or MAC standard. The EPA has not been able to find an ambient air causation for toxicity, So you use manipulated studies on precautionary principles that this Congress and no other Congress has ever agreed to. The EPA has taken it upon its own authority to set energy and manufacturing policy by way of manipulated studies to, again, overrule the Congress. In my opinion, this is unacceptable and should be stopped. I could go on and on, but my time has expired. Suffice it to say that you can look forward to an exciting hearing today and a dialogue when we get to the Q&A period. But thank you for your attendance. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
This time I recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Dingell, for a 3-minute opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your courtesy and for recognizing me, and I commend you for holding this hearing. First, Commissioner Jackson, I want to thank you for visiting the North American International Auto Show in Detroit last month with me. I hope you enjoyed your tour and the exciting new fuel-efficient and advanced technology vehicles coming from Detroit. I think there was a high level of energy at the show, and I thank you for taking the time to attend. It was most helpful to our people, and I hope the experience was valuable to you and to the EPA in understanding all of the problems we in Michigan have. EPA was also kind enough to allow me to testify at a field hearing in Detroit regarding the 2017 fuel efficiency standards, which I support and for which I commend you. I appreciated the opportunity, and I am encouraged that EPA and NHTSA held these field hearings across the country asking for input from the public. Not everyone can testify in Washington because of travel costs and other difficulties that are imposed on them. And so I believe it's important to get the feedback from as many Americans as possible on issues affecting their day-to-day lives back where they live. I hope that my colleagues in this committee will review the President's budget proposal for EPA as a working document that includes programs that may need more fundings and a few that perhaps could deal with less. Just because members disagree with some of the actions taken by EPA recently doesn't mean that we need to defund or to dismantle EPA. As I've said a number of times, the Clean Air Act alone has reduced key pollutants by 60% since 1970, while at the same time we saw the economy grow by over 200%. I believe we can maintain a healthful environment while creating jobs and growing businesses without going back to the days of mercury-tainted lakes or smog-filled air. I hope that we will have today in this committee a civil discussion where we can find ways to continue growing the economy while taking steps to preserve the environment without resorting to demagoguery and saber rattling and other similar unfortunate behavior. I'd like you also to know that I do have a few small remaining concerns in that I requested from EPA and others an explanation of why it is that we have that nice little problem where FERC may order people to produce electricity for which EPA will then fine them for violating the law. I hope that this is a matter that you will give some attention to when you get back down to EPA, and we'll look at the questions that I was asking earlier in this committee so that you can give us some answers as to why we have this curious, unfortunate, and I think obviously unfair event going forward. In any event, I want to tell you how much I appreciated the way that you have handled the fuel efficiency standards and the uniform standards for the United States and the agreements which we have with Canada, with California. I believe it has been very helpful to all of us, and I thank you for your courtesy in being here this morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Dingell. Our clock's still not working, but now our red light's working also. So we have a green light, a yellow light, and red light. And Mr. Upton is not here this morning, so I'm going to recognize Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania for a 3-minute opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that, and welcome here, Administrator Jackson. One of the things that I wanted to make a statement on had to do with how Pennsylvania is doing with natural gas. It's an abundant, clean fuel. We're excited about this opportunity. Of course, we want to make sure we do it right, that it's done in a way that respects the environment, that it is done in a way that makes sure that we are protecting the air and the land and the water. Along those lines, slightly more than a year ago, last March, I'd asked the EPA for information if they thought that Pennsylvania laws were adequate in their strength and adequately enforced. maybe things slip by. I still think it's important that the EPA does give information on what the states are doing, to give recommendations throughout that. I must admit I'm not one that favors that the EPA tells every state what to do, but given that many states are involved with this, I think it is valuable that the EPA can play a role in reviewing what states are doing with fracking. And I know that investigations are taking place, but also to make recommendations on the laws and the regulations within the various states. All of us would like us to have some energy independence and certainly have clean air, and certainly we recognize that natural gas is an abundant clean fuel resource, but we also want to make sure we do it right. And I'm hoping that that's something that can come out of the Environmental Protection Agency as we work with this. One of the things that's worth noting that many of the farms that I have visited in my district over the years, I noted some years ago there were certainly ones that in many cases were run down with old barns, old tractors, fence lines that were broken, and farms that were struggling along. Certainly now that they have found natural gas on their property from the Marcellus Shale and the Utica Shale, I've noticed consistently that these are farmers who've been able to buy new tractors, put a fresh coat of paint in their barn, build greenhouses so they can grow plants all year long, and hydroponics, other modern farming techniques, and really work to clean up their farms on multiple levels. So it has had a benefit for the economy as $2 billion worth of new investment have taken place in Pennsylvania. But above all, I'd like to emphasize again, it is important that the states and the EPA work in partnerships on this. And I'm still hoping that over time we'll be able to hear from the EPA on their recommendations of state standards with a very specific review of the laws, the regulations states have on the books, and recommendations they feel that they're being adequately enforced and directed. With that, I'd like to yield the remainder of my time to the gentleman from California, Mr. Bilber.
Thank you very much. And Administrator, one of the concerns I've had as somebody who's been involved in the environmental review and regulatory oversight is that too often we take the mentality of a cop of looking to give tickets rather than, let's just say, as a fire inspector who helps, works, and is proactive. One of my I just like to point out items that really I'm concerned about is how much the EPA can be proactive working with other agencies at actually helping people get to an environmental better option rather than always saying what they can't do and what they must do rather than creating opportunities. A good example, I think, that when we get down to it is that we may be talking about nuclear reactors causing a take of invertebrates and aquatic life. But how often do we talk about asking the regulatory agencies on nuke to take a look at gas-cooled reactors, which are totally eliminate that problem? But do we take the attitude of, well, that's not our department, we're just basically on the other side? These kind of proactive approaches, things like looking at why we don't open up more lands for rare earth extraction is going to be important if we're going to talk about clean, efficient electric energy too. Go back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Bilbright. I think that concludes today's opening statement, so I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes for the purpose of asking questions. I'm so anxious to ask questions, I guess I should let you testify first, Ms. Jackson. So I'd like to recognize you 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for inviting me to testify on the President's fiscal year 2013 budget for the Environmental Protection Agency. I'm joined by the agency's Chief Financial Officer, Barbara Bennett. EPA's budget request of $8.344 billion focuses on fulfilling EPA's core mission of protecting public health and the environment while making the sacrifices and tough decisions that Americans across the country are making every day. EPA's budget request fully reflects the President's commitment to reducing government spending and finding cost savings in a responsible manner while supporting clean air, clean water, and the innovative safeguards that are essential to an American.
Mr. Jackson, excuse me just 1 minute. Some of the members are having difficulty hearing. If you could move that a little bit closer.
I'll get closer to it. In some cases, we have had to take a step back from programs. This budget reflects a savings of $50 million through the elimination of several EPA programs and activities that have either met their goals or can be achieved at the state or local level by other federal agencies. Let me spend a moment discussing major elements of EPA's budget request. This request recognizes the importance of our partners at the state, local, and tribal level. As you know, they are at the front lines of implementing our environmental laws like the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act. In fact, the largest portion, 40% of EPA's funding request, is directed to the state and tribal assistance grants appropriation to support their efforts. Specifically, this budget proposes that $1.2 billion, nearly 15% of EPA's request, be allocated back to the states and tribes through categorical grants. This includes funding for state and local air quality management grants, pollution control grants, and the Tribal General Assistance Program. The budget also proposes that a combined $2 billion, another 25% of EPA's budget request, also goes directly to the states for clean water and drinking water state revolving funds. This funding will help support efficient system-wide investments and development of water infrastructure in our communities. We are working collaboratively to identify opportunities to fund green infrastructure, projects that can reduce pollution efficiently and less expensively than traditional gray infrastructure. Additionally, EPA's budget request would fund the protection of the nation's land and water in local communities, reflecting the President's commitment to restoring and protecting the Great Lakes. This budget requests that Congress maintain the current funding level of $300 million for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. This support will continue to be used for collaborative work with partners at the state, local, and tribal level, and also with nonprofit and municipal groups. The budget also requests support for protection of the Chesapeake Bay and several other treasured and economically significant water bodies. The budget reflects the importance of cleaning up contaminated land in our communities by requesting $755 million for continued support of the Superfund cleanup programs and maintains the agency's emergency preparedness and response capabilities. EPA's budget request makes major investments in its science and technology account of $807 million, or almost 10% of the total request. This request includes $576 million for research, including $81 million in research grants and fellowships to scientists and universities through the country for targeted research as part of the Science to Achieve Results, or STAR program, including children's health, endocrine disruption, and air monitoring research. Also, as part of this request, EPA includes funding increases into key areas that include green infrastructure and hydraulic fracturing. As I've mentioned before, natural gas is an important resource which is abundant in the U.S., but we must make sure that the ways we extract it do not risk the safety of public water supplies. This budget continues EPA's ongoing congressionally directed hydraulic fracturing study, which we have taken great steps to ensure is independent, peer-reviewed, and based on strong and scientifically defensible data. Building on these ongoing efforts, this budget requests $14 million in total to work collaboratively with the USGS, the Department of Energy, and other partners to assess questions regarding hydraulic fracturing. Strong science means finding the answers to tough questions, and EPA's request supports that work. We are making investments to support standards for clean energy and energy efficiency. Specifically, this budget supports EPA's efforts to introduce cleaner vehicles and fuels to expand the use of homegrown biofuels. This includes funding for EPA's vehicle and fuel standards and certification program to support certification and testing for all emission standards. This also includes implementation of the President's historic agreement with the auto industry for carbon pollution and fuel economy through 2025 for cars and light-duty vehicles, including testing support for NHTSA's fuel economy standards. Taken together, the administration standards for cars and light trucks are projected to result in $1.7 trillion of fuel savings and 12 billion fewer barrels of oil consumed. This funding will also help support implementation of the first ever carbon pollution and fuel economy standards for heavy-duty trucks. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for the opportunity to testify today. While my testimony reflects only some of the highlights of EPA's budget request, I look forward to answering all of your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Jackson. And now, at this time, I will recognize myself for 5 minutes for the purpose of asking questions. First thing's really not a question, but on February 23rd, we sent to the Honorable Jeffrey Zients, Acting Director of Office of Management and Budget, and when I say we, 221 members of Congress requesting that EPA stop its greenhouse gas rulemaking. So my question is, have you seen this letter, Ms. Jackson?
Yes, sir.
And so you will take that in consideration as you move forward. Is that correct?
Well, the letter's not to me, but certainly I've seen the copy that you sent me. Thank you.
And you have read it, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Now, your number one goal in the budget here states very clearly that the number one goal is taking action on climate change and improving air quality. And yet, in your opening statement, you didn't really mention climate change, and I was just curious why not?
I actually did, sir. I mentioned it in relationship to the clean car standards. And as I said at the end of the statement, there's much in the budget that I don't have time to highlight, mindful of the clock.
But that still is the #1 goal for EPA.
Well, we have actually 7 goals, but we have 5 that we outline, and it is listed first, and it is certainly one of our top priorities.
Okay. Now, I know that transparency is very important for all of government agencies and for the benefit of our constituents. And we've actually, my staff and others, have spent a lot of time just looking at the grants made by EPA. And it's extremely difficult to determine the total amount of grants issued by EPA. My question to you this morning would be, do you know the total amount of the grants given by EPA to foreign entities, foreign companies, foreign charitable organizations, NGOs? Do you know the dollar amount of those grants?
I believe we have, give me 1 second, please, Mr. Chairman. I know it's less than 2/3 of 1% of our funding for grant making in FY 2011. And
but do you have a dollar amount, Ms. Bennett?
Well, I can give you the amount for foreign activities, because very little of what is for foreign activity actually goes outside the country. That's $844,985.
Repeat that. 844,000 is what now?
For activities that have to do with our international programs, sir.
Okay, well, listen, that's okay. The reason I'm asking this question is when we do have a $16 trillion federal debt, and most economists believe that it is going to be a serious obstacle for economic development in the future. You said that 800-some thousand for international, and we have found, for example, that EPA gave a $718,000 grant to the China State Environmental Protection Administration to help China comply with some of the Stockholm Convention agreements. We found that you gave $700,000 to the Ministry of Thailand relating to methane gas at 12 pig farms in Thailand. We found that you gave money in Indonesia and so forth. Were you aware of this $718,000 given to the government of China?
Sir, I'm aware that for many years EPA has funded grants that are international or transboundary in nature. We have an international office. As I mentioned to you, I'm not sure the year of the particular grants you're citing, but oftentimes the proportion that goes outside entities is very small. They can.
Well, for one, don't think it's appropriate at this time when we have the debt that we have that we be giving money, for example, to China, of which we owe them more money than any other country, and yet we're borrowing money from them and then turning around and giving it back to them to help them with their environmental issues. So I hope that you would look into that and take some consideration about that. One other question I want to ask real quickly. I saw your presentation to the UC Berkeley Law Institute on Environmental Issues, and in that presentation you made the comment that this allegation that 230-some thousand additional people would have to be hired by EPA to implement its greenhouse gas regulations if they're implemented. You said that was, you summarily dismissed that and said that is not going to happen because of our tailoring rule. And as you know, there have been about 40 lawsuits filed questioning the validity of the tailoring rule. So if it's determined that the tailoring rule is not legal, it's invalid, do you have money in this budget to hire those 230-some thousand people that you yourself said you would need to enforce greenhouse gas regulations?
No, sir, because the number you're referencing was put forth in arguments by the government to show why the tailoring rule is so necessary, why it would be an unworkable result. That case, of course, is being argued, I believe, this morning.
Well, it's very clear the Department of Justice submitted this, but anyway, I do think that you can't just summarily dismiss that this is that you're going to win these lawsuits on the tailoring rule. So my time's expired, and Mr. Rush, I recognize you for the 5 minutes for the purpose of asking an open question.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator Jackson, as I indicated earlier, and you know this, I'm a big fan of the work that you are doing, and I want to commend you for your stick-to-itness in protecting the public health and ensuring that all Americans have access to clean air and water, especially in light of the relentless attacks against you and the agency you represent, attacks that I think we just heard a few minutes ago. One issue that was recently brought to my attention is the 316B rule that protects against the impingement and the entrainment of fish in cooling water intake structures that EPA is in the process of finalizing. And I don't want to get too much in the weeds on this, but I do want to make sure that the EPA is working with industry and listening to their concerns and recommendations before finalizing this rule. As you know, my main priority is protecting the public's health and welfare, and I want to make sure that the EPA gets this right and finalizes a rule that we all can live with. I think that it's very important that we remain mindful of the cost-benefit analysis when issuing the final 316B rule to make sure that we are not imposing undue costs that would in turn harm customers by unnecessarily raising energy prices. So again, Madam Administrator, I just urge you to work with industry and make sure that in the end your agency finalizes a rule that makes sense and is fair to all of the relevant stakeholders, especially the human stakeholders first and foremost. I think you understand what I mean. We've been hearing over and over again from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle about the undue costs associated with match rules, and I think that they are beginning to sound like a broken record over there. Madam Administrator, one increase in this year's request that I would like for you to discuss during the remainder of my time is your Community Action for a Renewed Environment, the CARE program. This very, very important and vital program has allowed communities living in environmental hotspots to come together to work and address the dangers in their neighborhood. It's a small program, but it makes a real big difference. A small program that carries a big punch. Unfortunately, last year the appropriators defunded the program, and I'm glad to see that the EPA is working to continue this vital program, and it has included in this year's request. Can you explain briefly what the CARE program is, who benefits, and what will the communities be able to do with the $2.5 million?
Thank you, Mr. Rush. The Community Action for a Renewed Environment grants are small grants. They go to community organizations to assist them in activities such as monitoring, community education and awareness, assistance. Much of environmental protection now is individual protection, actions that individuals take to either understand threats to their environment or to change their own actions. And so they've gone to a variety of groups, but they're pretty small grants, and they go to nonprofit organizations, community groups around environmental issues.
These are grants to local community-based organizations. what has been the history, if you can, of your of the results of these programs? Is there?
Yes, sir. The community groups are extremely fond of them. I've been asked several times about why they're being zeroed out. As you mentioned, they were zeroed out by the appropriators, and so in this cycle, we are attempting to put the money back in. We've had several examples of beautification projects that people undertake to address local environmental issues. That can be things like training people to be aware of litter, which is still a persistent problem in many, many communities. It can also mean understanding specific local issues, whether it be a small business that may need some assistance to understand that it's having an impact on the community. We have lots of people who come together around watershed issues, beloved watersheds, pharmaceutical collection days or hazardous waste collection days, and efforts to encourage businesses to separate waste in order to give amalgam. I have one from Marquette, Michigan. It was a 2006 care level grant. Earth Keepers Partnership included 140 congregations, 25 regional pharmacies, police departments, the Kinawa Bay Indian community, dental offices, and a financial community, all coming together to protect their environment.
Great program. Thank you. I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time's expired. I thought you may grab my question when you were talking about the cooling tower issue, Bobby. So too bad it's not in our committee jurisdiction. Otherwise, we could work together on that. I'd like to recognize myself 5 minutes for my questions. Again, welcome, Administrator Jackson. I've got 4 that I'm going to try to rush through. It's very difficult, as you know. But Lynn Westmoreland, my colleague from Georgia, is in the front row, and he and I were actually emailing over the weekend based upon a budget submission. So I represent rural America. He represents rural America. So in your spending guidance for the $212, it will distribute $15 million in drinking water tech assistance. Do you agree that it does not include the congressional directive to prioritize funding that is most beneficial to small communities?
I don't agree, sir, but I would have to.
Yeah, and it's small amount. I know it might be difficult. If you would get back to us on that, because the congressional intent was to make sure small communities would find the technical assistance most beneficial, and we think that if we can.
I actually have an answer, so if you wouldn't mind my correcting myself. EPA is not requesting funding in the 2013 budget for technical assistance because the agency believes that the states are best positioned to develop the technical assistance plans. The states are allowed to set aside 2% of their drinking water state revolving fund for small systems, and most states are using that set aside.
Okay, well, we're going to follow up on this legislatively to implement a directive asking you to consider small water applicants to demonstrate the level of support or small communities. In small town rural America, they don't have the big ability of large municipal systems and money. So if we can work on that, I think Mr. Westmoreland would appreciate it. We'd like to talk to you about that. Now I want to go to the Superfund cleanup, speed, and funding. Sandoval Zinc Company was added to the national priorities list in 2011. It's in my district. I visited it. There are lengthy delays, obviously, and when something gets on the cleanup list. Can you tell me what % of remedial budget do you spend on physical cleanup versus administrative cost? My point is this, and that's something you can get back with me too on. The point is, when we've talked with the region headquarters, I've been told numerous times we can clean this up rapidly when it's initially identified, but if it's delayed, then it gets in through the whole system. Then you have litigation, long terms, and the cost-benefit analysis of moving quicker versus later is great. Let me move to the definition of solid waste issue. Case law and state statute is pretty clear. Do you agree that RCRA applies to discarded material, disposed, abandoned, and thrown away?
The RCRA statute disposes, the waste statute. I believe that's part of the definition of waste.
Do you agree that recyclable material is not discarded for permanent disposal? It is destined for beneficial reuse?
Yes, although, as you know, the definition of recycled material is subject to certain regulatory findings.
Well, that's where we're headed. Since we agree case law and statute are clear, what specific authority do you have to change the definition of solid waste under RCRA?
Well, we can't change any statutory definition.
That's exactly what I want. That's good. That's good. We can follow up with that. But there is a fear that you are, and it affects the recycling industry, the beneficial use section. Let me, I still have a minute and a half left, and I want to get to RCRA 2002 subsection B requires you to review all regulations every 3 years. You're about to be sued by the environmental community for failure to comply with this part of the law. Do we really want an agency to go down a very costly path of reviewing regulations based on arbitrary date that will be impossible to meet? So the question is, in reviewing all regulations, is reviewing all regulations every 3 years even feasible? I mean, you've been there, you're going in your 4th year. Have you, in this 3rd year, the end of 3rd, now your 4th year, have you been able to review all EPA regulations?
I think EPA has a statutory obligation which we try to meet, but there are plenty of cases where we are not on time.
Yeah, it's actually not feasible. And then the other issue, as we're trying to analyze all these, can you give me a cost projection of what it is just to try to evaluate all these regulations within a 3-year time frame as statute requires?
Well, it is not without cost and resources. We're in the middle of the review that the President ordered to look for outdated regulations.
So, and I think that's an important point. So as we talk about this, whether you want to work with us or not, I think it would be in both of our interests if we can design a system that identifies, based upon science, problems, and then reevaluate those rules, versus just having an arbitrary 3-year review process that we can never meet, that throws us in litigation for not meeting, and that could help. It would help the administration trying to put aside things that we can do and not try to accomplish all the stuff that we're never going to be able to do. I appreciate your time, and with that, I yield back the balance of my time. Chair now recognizes the Vice Chairman of my committee, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, welcome, Madam Administrator. Like all of us, I have a lot of questions in the 5 minutes. My first question is, first of all, the sale of fraudulent biodiesel credits has emerged as a serious issue affecting the motor fuel sector. And these credits originally came from a company called Clean Green Fuels that EPA had been investigating for well over a year. It turned out the company was a sham and could not produce any actual biodiesel, but was making money selling fake credits. The problem is Green Fuels was an EPA-approved producer, and its credits were listed in the agency's automated transaction system, so it looked like they were legitimate. Formerly, EPA did not inform any of the potential buyers of the investigation while it was underway, but rather than treating the refiners who purchased these fraudulent credits as victims, your agencies decided to go after them with notices of violation in November of 2011. Why did the EPA go after the good faith purchasers of these credits in November of last year?
Well, Mr. Green, we understand the importance of the RIN market. It is a marketplace, and it is important to the marketplace that there be valid credits, and that those who are buying them, as we say in our rules, ensure that they're buying valid credits. There is fraud that is potential in the system, and although we enforce to look for opportunities to crack down on fraud, part of the system in this marketplace also requires that buyers beware, and that they ensure that what they're buying, that they make some effort to ensure that they are not being subject to fraudulent RINs.
Well, obviously, I think that the EPA has them listed, and on the automated transaction system, punishing the good faith purchasers may be a little over the top instead of going after them. Could EPA have done a better job in presenting the fraud and protecting those companies who are required to buy these credits in order to comply with the law?
Well, I think EPA did its job in responding to a complaint. We went to the so-called producer of this biofuel. There was nothing there. In one case, there are 2 cases. In one, there was literally nothing there. In the other, they had shut down all the equipment and were selling for fuel they weren't making. So EPA did its job. It certainly notified those who had purchased, and it made clear, in order for the marketplace to be fair for those who are doing the right thing, there has to be a penalty for those who are not doing the right thing, and people need to ensure that what they're buying represents more than just a piece of paper.
Well, and I agree we want to do that, but I want to make sure that we don't end up punishing folks who are trying to comply with the law based on the EPA system. Is EPA considering changes to prevent similar instances of fraud from reoccurring, maybe more immediate investigation and more timely notice to the purchasers?
Sir, EPA's limited enforcement resources are spread pretty thin. When we found out about the case, we certainly went out and enforced against it. But our rules are very clear that it requires both parties, the buyer and the seller, to engage in ensuring that what they're doing is actually not fraudulent, but real production of biofuels. It's important to the small producers, and the large oil companies who are buying these RINs certainly have resources that they could bring to bear as well.
Well, I know we have some large oil companies and large refiners, but again, in some cases, they relied on information from the EPA. My next question is the President's budget for FY13 budget includes an interagency study that the DOE, EPA, and the U.S. Geological Survey are partnering on to examine environmental and health effects of hydraulic fracking. Can you explain the purpose behind the study and how this is any different from what the EPA has been currently doing?
Certainly, Mr. Green. The study is a expansion. Right now, EPA is doing a congressionally mandated study to look at the impact of hydraulic fracturing on drinking water supplies. That's been publicly scoped and independently reviewed as we're beginning it. This is additional money to work with our partner agencies, as I said in my opening remarks, to look at air quality, water quality, and ecosystems impacts, to ask the hard questions to ensure that fracking remains safe. Okay.
I understand that the hopefully independent peer review will be incorporated. Will there be stakeholder input to be incorporated?
Well, we're just beginning to scope that with our federal agencies, but and obviously we have to wait for budget approval, but I think we would look to do a transparent and valid study and look for public input as well.
And I know you and I have discussed this in the past, and would you agree that there's no way we can develop our vast natural gas resources without the use of hydrofracking?
That's right. The natural gas resources that the country has are in shale rock, and fracking is the way to release those resources. It needs to be done safely and responsibly, but it would need to be done.
And I think we agree responsibly, but we still need the natural gas. Mr. Chairman, I don't know how much time I have, but I have one last question. Not everything is cut in the budget, and I said earlier this request included some important programs like the electronic manifest system. The current system of paper manifest is outdated and labor-intensive and simply not as safe as it should be. Administrator Jackson, what is the purpose of the electronic manifest system?
Well, to move to a paperless system, it is easier for record generation, record retrieval, record transparency of information. It's about $2 million in our budget, and we think that it would be a giant step forward and mindful of the times we're in, sir.
The cost of the system is $2 million, and did you receive that amount? And I know I'm out of time.
None, sir.
Okay.
In 12, we did not, and we're requesting it in 13.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I've run out of time, but I know Chairman Shimkus and I have talked about some of the things we can do with this, and so I look forward to working with you on it.
This time, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Administrator, back in October, I think October the 12th, you appeared before a hearing of this committee, and I asked you a question about the number of credit cards at the EPA and what the limits were and how much money was spent and what the criteria. We put that in a follow-up letter to your administration on November the 1st. We've still not gotten an answer. Can you enlighten us on the status of that query and what the response is going to be to it?
I think you have your EPA women mixed up. I think that was Ms. Bennett's hearing, and we will certainly endeavor to get you an answer as soon as we can.
Okay. Do you know where it is? Do you know anything about it other than we haven't got any response at all?
I know we're preparing a response, and we'll be getting a response to you, sir.
Okay. You've been doing quite a bit of travel which is a good thing, I think. I don't have a problem with administration officials traveling. But some of the locations seem a little bit, I won't say puzzling, but interesting. You were recently down in Brazil at a conference on urban sustainability. Can you tell us what urban sustainability is?
I accompanied the President of the United States when he visited Brasilia to meet with President Rousseff, and there the two presidents decided to focus on sustainability issues in advance of the Rio +20 conference, which is a UN conference to be held in Brazil. Urban sustainability is an issue facing Rio de Janeiro as they look at the games that are coming in the next several years, and as the large influx of people into cities in much of the developing world. They asked us for information on what cities here are doing that help them to be green, to help them to save energy, to feed their people, to provide energy and water and waste for all those people who are moving in. We're working with the city of Philadelphia. They're doing some very innovative wastewater work.
Can you tell us what that trip cost?
Not off the top of my head, sir.
Can you tell us what your travel budget is?
We can certainly get you the information, sir.
Can you tell us who set your travel budget?
Our overall travel budget is down and has been decreased every year. I set our agency's budget by asking our folks to, as much as possible.
Would you say your personal travel budget is several million a year, several $100,000 a year, tens of thousands?
I don't know. We're happy to get you the numbers.
You don't have any idea? And you don't have any idea who set your budget? Is it just up to you?
Well,
if you want to go somewhere, you go?
I'm the head of the agency. I take responsible for the reductions in travel that have happened every year that I've been here. Yes, sir. Okay.
I want to ask about your nonprofit grants. We went to your website, and some of them seem to be absolutely total sense. The Air and Waste Management Association, the American Lung Association, but some of them are a little bit puzzling. You've got 1,000 friends in Iowa that you gave $30,000 to. You're better off in Pennsylvania. You have 10,000 friends that you gave $85,000 to. The Alabama People Against a Littered State got $75,000. But then we come to some that I'm very confused. The Bible Baptist Church got $200,000. Why would EPA give money to a Baptist Bible church for $200,000?
Why not, sir?
Okay. How about Camp Kumbaya? Your administration gave $20,280 to Camp Kumbaya. Can you tell me what that's about?
I'm happy to get you information on any of our small community grants, sir.
But what's the environmental core mission of Camp Kumbaya?
I don't personally know Camp Kumbaya, sir. I've never been there, but I'm happy to get you information.
How about Art from Scrap?
Art from Scrap?
Art from Scrap. You gave $18,000 to Art from Scrap.
Yes, sir.
Not you personally, but the EPA. Do you know what the nonprofit budget is for the EPA?
We give several grant programs. I am guessing, but it is simply an uneducated guess, which you're not supposed to do in a hearing. Many of these are under the community.
Is it hundreds of millions? Is it tens of millions? Is it?
It's more than millions. It's probably several million, because the CARE grant program in the past has been about $2 to $2.5 million a year. It was zeroed out this year, so we are not giving those grants. And I can tell you that many communities are concerned.
I would be interested at least in what happened to why Camp Kumbaya. That just seems to me to be a little bit difficult to justify. Anyway, my time's expired, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. At this time, recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Dingell, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you for your courtesy. Madam Administrator, yes or no? I see that the President's fiscal year 2013 budget request for CERCLA, or Superfund, is $35 million less than the current fiscal year. Are you comfortable that CERCLA can continue to carry out its responsibilities and the current cleanup obligations without slowing down current efforts with this reduction in spending? Yes or no?
Yes, but we cannot start any new cleanup, sir. So.
All right. So that may very well put you down, rather slow you down. And I'm referring to cuts here in both Superfund in general and in enforcement. Now, next question. I, along with two of my colleagues from the Great Lakes region, will request the Appropriations Committee maintain level funding for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. I know that you've been supportive in the past restoration efforts in the Great Lakes. Do you believe that level funding will adequately support Great Lake restoration and invasive species prevention and control efforts? Please answer yes or no.
Yes. Yes, sir.
Madam Administrator, are you aware, or rather, as you are aware, the state of California is moving forward with the Level 3 tailpipe emission standards for carbon monoxide, NOx, and hydrocarbons. What is the status of EPA's efforts regarding equivalent standards?
EPA has undertaken a look at reducing the level of sulfur. Those are the so-called Tier 3 standards. They are essentially similar to California's, and that rulemaking continues. We are working still in-house on proposed rules.
Thank you. Madam Administrator, what is EPA doing to ensure that American manufacturers, most specifically American auto manufacturers, will not have to worry about a patchwork of regulations on these requirements?
Sir, the National Car Standards, Clean Car Standards, which EPA is proud to have partnered with the Department of Transportation on, give one national standards for vehicles for both fuel economy and greenhouse gas emissions from now until the year 2025. We've been told over and over again that those reasonable common sense standards give automakers the ability to innovate, to move forward with a clear set of standards so that they can go about their business and grow manufacturing and, we hope, grow exports of their product.
Regarding the mercury and air toxic standards, if utilities need a one-year extension, they need to request it from their local permitting authorities. In my case, the Department of Environmental Quality of the State of Michigan. What assurances can you provide that EPA will not override the permitting authority's decision to grant that one-year extension?
Well, first, I believe very strongly that state permitting agencies, having run a permit agency myself, are the front line and know their individual permittees best. But second, the President of the United States, at the time that we issued those standards, ordered an executive order for EPA to give the additional year, to be lenient and to work to ensure that states did it. It is still their ultimate authority as to whether or not to give the year, but EPA is certainly not posed or poised to override the President's executive order.
Now, Madam Administrator, utilities in the state of Michigan are concerned that they will first have to be in violation of the mercury and air toxic standards before requesting a second-year waiver to comply with the new standards. Is that the case? Yes or no?
No, it is not, but it does bear a little explanation, sir.
You don't mind if we are concerned. Would you give us some more comment on this for the purposes of the record, if you please?
Yes, sir. What we've asked utilities to do, and which I believe they are doing, is working with their public utility commissions and state regulators now to look forward and put forth their plans for their fleets on how they're going to comply with the standards. If in doing so they identify plants that they believe need to go longer than that fourth year.
Now, we have this concern. If not, what do the utilities in Michigan or elsewhere need to do in order to be given that second one-year extension? That's a matter of great concern to our people.
I think the earlier that they can come forward, sir, and let us know that they believe they're going to need that second year, not waiting until the end when they do face noncompliance, they can and we can work with the state to ensure that through an agreement they have additional time. They will have to show that they need the time and that there's no other power, but those are findings they need to make.
Now, Madam Administrator, I understand that the new source performance standards are currently being reviewed by OMB. Can you tell me if the standards will apply to modified sources, yes or no?
Sir, it's not a good idea for me to speculate on rules that are still in review. So I would prefer respectfully to ask that we wait until those rules are out for public comment. They will go through full public comment, but I can tell you that we have endeavored to be reasonable and to reflect the fact that technology is limited for existing sources.
You can understand that our people have a great deal of concern on this matter. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your courtesy.
Thank you. This time I recognize the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Terry, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Administrator, I'm concerned about the efforts being undertaken at U.S. EPA to supplant state regulators as the primary regulators on a number of environmental issues, particularly in areas where the states have been sole regulators for decades. Quite frankly, I'm very proud of my folks in Nebraska and think they've done a fine job. Since this is a budget hearing, it strikes me as if the federal government were going to push the states aside so it can occupy the regulatory field in a way it never has. That you are going to need lots of new bodies in your regional offices and D.C. headquarters, as well as lots of new budget authority to pay for these people and programs. So I'd appreciate it if you'd please state the first part of the question. The additional budget authority EPA needs to increase its in-house expertise and expand its programmatic and enforcement reach to carry out these authorities, especially as it relates to permitting, inspections, technical compliance assistance, and regulatory enforcement.
In fact, Mr. Terry, in general, the budget goes a different direction. I used to run a state program, and I've committed that while I'm here, we're going to increase grants to the states and the tribes so that they can do permitting and enforcement. There's a net $113 million increase in what we call the state tribe categorical grants. Even in a tough budget year, it's one of the few places we're plussing up. Air quality, water pollution, tribal grants, information management, those are computers, and public water supply. There are a few places where we are cutting, for example, beaches, not a huge concern, I know, in your state, but certainly I've heard from some of your colleagues. But the money is up because we believe that never can the federal government supplant the states.
So the budget increases will be in the grants part, not in the personnel within the EPA, particularly in Region 7. Is that a yes or no? I only have 5 minutes.
We are not looking. We're looking at overall personnel decreases, I believe. So
okay.
Is that correct?
Well, I think it's an increase of 25.
It's an increase of 25 people across our 17,000 plus person agency. So we're not talking about
what would be the impact to regulatory uncertainty between the states and the EPA and state primary delegations?
Could you repeat the question?
No, I'm going to go on to the next one. I'm sorry. In FYI 213, are you planning to propose revisions to the National Ambient Air Quality Standard for particulate matter? If so, when?
Yes, probably. They are due by statute. We have not announced a date, and that date has not been set.
Can we be assured that the EPA will not be proposing any change to the current PM10 coarse particulate standards?
Yes, I have so stated, sir. We will not be changing. We do not anticipate, based on the science that we've seen so far, that a change will be warranted. But again, the proposal...
Okay. Does the EPA publish in one publicly accessible place a list of all the petitions for rulemaking that are submitted to the agency?
I do not believe so, sir, but we'll double-check the answer to my question.
All right. We haven't found one if there is. So when you check and confirm that there is not one place that public or members of Congress could go to, will you commit to posting that information on the EPA's website starting this year?
Petition, sir?
Yes.
I think that's a fair request. I'm happy to look into it.
All right. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Terry. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to welcome Lisa Jackson before our committee. I've worked with her for many years, dating back to her time as the Commissioner of the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. Since you've been at the helm of the EPA, I believe our country's made great strides in improving air quality, protecting America's waters, and cleaning up our communities, and these accomplishments are crucial to protecting human health and the environment. Unfortunately, the Republicans in Congress, and on the campaign trail in particular, are attempting to argue that protecting our environment is somehow hurting our economy. I don't think that's true. I don't think you need to choose between a strong economy and a clean environment. I think they bolster each other. And I think it's oftentimes my colleagues on the other side make broad generalizations without looking at the facts. According to the Nonpartisan Economic Policy Institute, EPA's toxics rule will lead to the creation of 84,500 jobs between now and 2015. And I just mentioned that as one example of how safeguarding our environment can help bolster the economy. I know in tough economic times it's difficult. Choices have to be made. But I have confidence that, Lisa, that your agency will continue its success in protecting human health and the environment. I wanted to ask a couple questions specifically about New Jersey. As you know, in the state of New Jersey, we have the most Superfund sites in the nation. We're the most densely populated state, and it's crucial that these sites be cleaned up. The President's budget proposes the lowest level for Superfund cleanup in the last 10 years, and that's going to make it difficult to expedite cleaning up these sites. I think it also states in the budget that there will be no new construction projects. And, you know, this goes back to the issue of jobs again. Cleaning up Superfund sites provides quality jobs in local communities. Before it expired in '95, the money to clean up the Superfund sites came from taxes on polluters. But unfortunately, because Congress has not reauthorized the taxes, the burden of funding cleanup now falls on the shoulders of tax-paying Americans. I've introduced a bill, the Superfund Polluter Pays Act, that would reinstate the taxes on oil and chemical companies. And I just wanted to ask you, given the fiscal austerity in our current budget, do you agree that reinstating the Superfund taxes would enable EPA to clean up these toxic sites faster and create more jobs?
Yes, sir. The administration has come out in favor of reinstatement of that tax.
Now, I heard you mention the elimination of the beach grants in the President's budget proposal. That program, actually I was part of the original authorization of the beach grants and the reauthorization. It was funded at only $10 million last year, but these grants have resulted in a number of monitored beaches tripling nationwide since the program started. And states utilize these funds to monitor water quality, notify the public when the coastal waters are not safe. I'm just afraid that without these grants, the trend will reverse itself, and many states will just choose to stop monitoring many of their beaches. So I wanted to ask you if you think that EPA's beach grants have been successful over the years in expanding the number of beaches tested and keeping swimmers out of contaminated waters. Comment on the program, if you would.
Yes, sir. As I said, I knew some of my of the colleagues wouldn't be happy here.
I would have asked it anyway, even if you hadn't brought it up.
I know. Well, beach grants have been very successful, sir, and this is one of the tough choices, but it's mindful of the past success, which is what influences our decision. For most of the history, and thanks to your leadership, the grants helped establish monitoring programs and systems and teams of people who now do that work. And this is simply the federal government saying that this really is a state or local function. It's best done that way. I certainly know that that's how it's done primarily in New Jersey, and that our time for funding this as seed funding is over, and it's time for those communities to take over.
See, the reason I disagree, and I really think it's important for us to restore the funds, is because you're right that when New Jersey had it on its own, and you were the commissioner at the time, that we did a lot to fund the program, and we did all the things that we were supposed to do. But the problem is other states were not doing it, and then it becomes an unfair advantage. In other words, we're closing our beaches when they should be closed. Other states are not because they don't do the testing and the monitoring. And I really think that the program right now, we have a reauthorization bill to expand it to do a lot more things than are actually being done now. Tests for different chemicals and compounds that aren't tested for now, looking at sources of pollution. So my fear is that if we eliminate the federal dollars, a lot of states won't do it, and we won't really know. The whole idea is right to know, and we won't really know which beaches should be open and which are not. In fact, a lot of states don't even want to do it because they don't even want to admit they have dirty beaches. In addition to that, I think that the federal dollars can leverage more state dollars to do more things with the program. So I'm going to fight hard to try to get that money reinstated, and I appreciate your acknowledging that it's really money well spent. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Plone. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton, for 5 minutes of questions, the chairman of the full committee.
Thank you, Administrator Jackson, for being here this morning. I do have a couple questions. I apologize for being in and out with lots of different things going on. I appreciated the letter that I think Gina McCarthy sent. You're aware of this yesterday, or maybe it's, yesterday, to Chairman Whitfield. And in that letter, on the first page, you write in the last paragraph on that first page, that is why EPA conducted extensive refinery modeling to understand the cost impacts of a variety of fuel requirements. As a result, the only fuel requirement we are considering for Tier 3 is one that would lower the amount of sulfur in gasoline. So my question is, does that mean that you will not look at the Reid vapor pressure or the octane components of a final rule? Is that what I read between the lines?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much, yes. Yes, sir. I agree with that interpretation.
Okay. Good. Now, we are all concerned about job losses across the country, and I know there was a study that came out that showed a number of refineries that are closing from California, New Mexico, New Jersey, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and the Virgin Islands that total 5,500 jobs. And they're closing for a variety of different reasons. And one of the reasons is the regulatory burden that many of these have. And I know that with the refineries that are closing, particularly in Marcus Hook, Pennsylvania, as well as in the Philadelphia, the Sunoco refineries there, totaling about 2,000 jobs, there is a concern that they are that the fuel for those areas will be coming in from overseas and will be refined, losing those jobs. The question is, have you taken a look, as we all are concerned about the planet, have you taken a look at the regulations that our refineries currently have versus what they are in some of the new refineries that have been built in the world, such as China and in the Caribbean? Have you actually looked at the difference in the regulations between what we have and what we have when we close these refineries, what in fact that refined oil will have in terms of the regulations impacting them?
Well, generally, yes, I think the program specialists have an understanding of the differences between our regulations and maybe other countries. Of course, the Virgin Islands we regulate and have regulated for years in the Virgin Islands government. I have to say that those private sector decisions about refineries and their decisions to close, I have not seen any of them pointing directly to regulatory burdens in those decision makings. And I think the administration is going to look carefully, especially at the recent decisions, and keep an eye on them, and also hope that they work with local and regional parties to address any shortages that might cause.
Well, as I understand it, one of the main reasons that the refineries are closing in the Philadelphia area, that they are now going to refine that in Nigeria rather than in the United States. And it was in large part because of the cost differential between the two.
Sir, again, it's a private sector decision. I will not speak for them. I will tell you that my understanding has been about supply, but I only know what I read of their decision-making process.
EPA was recently criticized in the magazine The Economist for how it measures benefits from the expensive MAC rules. I don't know if you saw the story or not. It was just recently here, February 18th issue. The article explains that when analyzing the costs and benefits of the rules, most of the benefits come from co-benefits. And the question that I have is, why doesn't the EPA take the time to analyze the public health benefits associated with most of the pollutants actually being regulated, and wouldn't that make much more sense?
I personally believe that the co-benefits and the economic benefits of those are valid and important. But to answer your question more directly, in the case of mercury, for example, which is a neurotoxin, the social science of economics simply isn't to the point where EPA can put a number on the value of lost IQ points or some of the things we'd be asking to try to value. We certainly know and have good science and data to do things like premature death from soot pollution or asthma attacks from smog-forming pollutants. But mercury is admittedly more difficult, and so we do the best we can on mercury, but we don't ignore the co-benefits as well.
Now, as you know, we passed legislation in the House to try and extend the time for these Boiler MAC rules to be put into effect to allow you more time. The federal court made the decision that they did in January. Are you all at all interested in the House or Senate moving such legislation for a delay to give you the time to do these right?
We are certainly mindful of the work that's been done here, sir, and I do hope that you know that we have been working in our re-proposed rules. The cost of compliance went down by 50%, mainly because we're taking into account the importance of biomass in acknowledging that that's going to be important feedstock. So we are looking, as you know, right now the Boiler MAC is set for finalization in late spring of this year.
Okay. I see the red light on and yield back.
Thank you. This time I recognize the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Castor, for 5 minutes of question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And welcome, Madam Administrator and Ms. Bennett. Citizens across America value clean air and clean water. So I want to thank you and everyone at EPA for what you're doing to protect our air and our water, and for your partnership with states and local communities. Now, two of the most important partnerships with our local communities involve the state, the Clean Water and Safe Drinking Water Loan programs. These are the vital dollars that help with stormwater infrastructure, replacing old pipes, wastewater infrastructure that's not real exciting, but they are vitally important when it comes to keeping our neighborhoods clean and our water bodies clean all across the country. They're also important job creators too, and the Recovery Act gave us a nice shot in the arm to help create jobs while at the same time leaving us with a lasting legacy of important infrastructure improvements. The issue is that the needs all across the country outweigh the resources. How would you characterize the backlog right now in stormwater, wastewater infrastructure? What is the magnitude?
Yeah, independent estimates have put it at around $300 billion, I believe, nationwide.
$300 billion, and I would guess in my home state of Florida, it's well beyond a single billion. It's probably much more than that. We have these aging water pipes. They need improvements. So I'm troubled that the budget request actually provides a haircut. How do you explain this?
Tough choices, Ms. Castor. You know, we balance it by the fact that we have, because as you noted, the Recovery Act gave such a shot in the arm to these programs. It's been about $18 billion during this administration put into water infrastructure programs. And it is another cut. Tough choices, but we're at the point where we don't really have many places we can cut except in these infrastructure investments. We are also mindful that we would like to get to a place where these are loan programs for the most part, where there is a revolving, almost self-sustaining point. But we're years away from that. But we continue.
I hope the Congress will respond overall by giving a boost to these vital clean water and drinking water initiatives that are important partnerships for our local communities and the states, and find savings elsewhere in the budget. Next, I'd like to ask you about the good news out of the administration on more fuel-efficient cars. I think this is great news for American families and businesses. It appears that you all are building on the success that the Congress in 2007 passed the first increase in automobile fuel economy in 32 years. That was since 1975. We boosted mileage to 35 miles per gallon by 2020. And I have to tell you, I have a member of the family who last year bought one of these fuel-efficient cars. He's getting 50 miles per gallon, and he really enjoys driving past these gas stations, no matter what their signs have posted. Can you summarize for us what the next steps are? What is EPA doing to work on even more fuel-efficient vehicles?
As you noted, Ms. Kester, and thank you, the final rules for 2012 to 2016 light-duty vehicles were finalized in April of 2010. We've proposed rules for light-duty vehicles, those are cars, 2017 to 2025. Those were proposed in November. We anticipate finalizing those later this year. We signed and published rules for heavy-duty vehicles. Those are large trucks. They were published in the Federal Register in September of 2011.
Put it in the terms of the average American family and business. What does it mean? Cash back in their pocket?
Absolutely. This means more money in your pocket and less trips to the gas station. It means that $1.7 trillion saved over the lifetime of the cars, going all the way to 2025. 12 billion barrels of oil will never have to import into this country. So for the average car owner, as the cars get more and more efficient, up to $8,000 in fuel savings over the life of the car, more than made up for a little additional price up front. So we're very proud of it because we feel as though it's part of the President's approach, which is we need to have energy, but we also need to conserve the energy we have. And it's positioned our automakers to compete with automakers around the world.
I think it's making a real difference. Thank you.
Gentlelady's time has expired. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Walden, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Jackson, it's good to have you back before the committee. I wanted to follow up on something that my colleague from Nebraska, Mr. Terry, had raised regarding putting things on the website. And it's my understanding that, you know, you're an advocate for transparency in the process, as I am, having chaired the transition for the Speaker here in the House, to try and open up our process, make it more transparent to the public, because that's who we both work for at the end of the day. My understanding is that there are situations where groups file suit against your agency, and literally on the same day, there are settlements entered into by your agency with those groups. And I guess what we're trying to get here at is trying to make sure that the public has an awareness of that sort of litigation. And so when it's filed against your agency, are you willing to notice that on your website in a very timely manner? This would be the notice of intent to sue. So you get a notice of intent to sue.
Yes, sir.
And so when you get those, is there a way you could just put those up on the website so that the American taxpayers would know? Would that be a hardship on the agency?
It requires some minimal resources. We're happy to do it. I'm not aware of any settling the same day. We usually, when we receive a lawsuit, we are almost always called by the press, and we simply say that we're reviewing it. So.
But when you get the notice of intent to sue.
Right. Those are not actual lawsuits. Those are 60-day notices.
Can you put those up on your website?
I think so, absolutely, sir.
So
I
you
will look
commit-
into the resources that are required to put that up, but it seems like a
shouldn't be
fair request.
in this great world of our new technologies. And people are interested in that,
My
obviously. They want to
16-year-old
know.
can probably figure out how to do it.
Yeah,
quite
there you go.
clearly.
And fix the flashing clock on the. Oh, we don't even have VCRs anymore, do we? So I guess that's the part. And then when you are going to enter into a settlement, is there any noticing that can be done for the public to know about that? Because there's this concern that, and it can happen on the right, it can happen on the left, that you get a notice, someday after you're gone and somebody else is there. It doesn't seem fair that a group can threaten to sue, notice of intent to sue, and the agency can then sit down and make it almost a friendly lawsuit and reach a settlement, an agreement, and the public really never sees that in a transparent way.
I can assure you, sir, EPA does not enter into sweetheart settlements. And so if there is information that we can provide, when we enter into consent decrees, of course, those are subject to public comment before the consent decree is lodged with the court. And if there is an administrative settlement, oftentimes those are discussed but not subject to public comment.
But they could be made public.
Well, I do not know that, sir, but I do think that the agency needs to preserve its right to discuss, and whether it's industry or an environmental group, we get sued by state and local governments as well. We need to preserve our right to enter into discussions to try to avoid court costs.
No. I don't think anybody disagrees with that. It's just when I think the taxpayers feel they may be shut out of any of that. And so you get a notice of intent to sue. They don't know that really happens unless you make it public.
Usually the group suing us does, but
right,
they're the ones who initiate
but
it.
not necessarily everybody else knows. That's why this thing with modern technology is putting it on the
I don't see
website.
any concerns with putting notices that we receive up, and I'm happy to look into that.
Okay. I return my time.
Thank you. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator Jackson, the House Republicans have urged you not to issue pending proposed new source performance standards under the Clean Air Act to reduce carbon pollution from new power plants. They argue that the regulations will hurt the economy and are not necessary. I could not disagree more strongly. Climate change is the greatest environmental threat we face. Although these standards will have a modest impact on the overall problem, they are critical as a first step in tackling carbon pollution. They'll boost the economy by providing certainty to the power sector, allowing investment decisions to be made and new generation to be built. Administrator Jackson, you're an engineer, a practical problem solver. Does it make any sense to pretend climate change isn't happening and hope we can deal with it later?
No, sir, it doesn't.
Denying the science and the facts is, I think, indefensible, and putting off action until later is utterly irresponsible. According to the highly regarded International Energy Agency, if the world doesn't change course on climate now, within just 10 years, we will have built enough high-carbon energy infrastructure to lock our planet into an irreversible and devastating amount of global warming. Administrator Jackson, making smart choices when building new infrastructure is precisely what these regulations are all about. Isn't that right?
That's right, sir. And giving standards so people have certainty. That's an important part of the regulatory process.
These new source performance standards would set limits for carbon pollution that would apply when we invest the billions of dollars in new power plant that will be around for half a century or more. That seems to me common sense. The reality is that the market is already driving these choices. The development of huge low-cost natural gas supplies, plus uncertainty about inevitable future carbon control requirements, is deterring investments in new coal plants without carbon controls. But we're hearing the same old claims that EPA's proposed regulations would drive up energy prices and destroy the U.S. economy. That's what Republicans said in 2010 about the requirements for Clean Air Act new source review permits for carbon pollution. Administrator Jackson, the carbon pollution permitting requirements have been in place for over a year now. Is there any evidence that they're harming the economy?
None, sir. None that I'm aware of, certainly. I believe people are getting permits and applying for them and moving forward. In certain jurisdictions, EPA is processing those permits.
In fact, these requirements are encouraging new sources to be more energy efficient in a cost-effective manner, and I think that's going to be good for the economy overall. Every week we see new published scientific studies finding that climate change is already occurring, finding new threats to ecosystems, food supplies, and human health from a rapidly warming planet, finding the time to avoid a disastrous degree of warming is rapidly running out, and yet this Republican Congress does worse than fiddling while Rome burns. They're actually trying to stop anyone else from fighting the fire, and I want to commend your efforts to fight this fire, and I urge you to take the critical steps of issuing carbon pollution standards for power plants as soon as possible. Administrator Jackson, EPA is responsible for protecting our air, our water, our land. In the next fiscal year, the administration is proposing to achieve its mission with a meager 1/4% of the federal budget. This equals 81% of the agency's fiscal year 2010 budget, 56% of the agency's fiscal year 2009 budget. Clearly, the President is proposing a funding level that the agency has to make difficult choices, cut funding for valuable programs, and start funding at priority goals. I'd like to ask you about some of these some of these tough choices. In the 2013 budget, we have significant cuts to the drinking water program. Just yesterday, the American Water Works Association released a new assessment of state of drinking water infrastructure in this country, and they said in this report, our drinking water infrastructure needs a $1 trillion investment over the next 25 years if we're to maintain current levels of water service. The ANWA concludes that, quote, the more we delay, the harder the job will be done. Administrator Jackson, has the agency determined that funding drinking water infrastructure is no longer important?
Certainly not, sir.
Does EPA still believe that state revolving loan funds are important tools for delivering safe drinking water and protecting public health?
Certainly, sir.
I have other questions along these lines about Superfund and other radon programs and others. My time is over. I'd like to submit these questions to you in writing and get a response in writing as well.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. This time, recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Murphy, for 5 minutes. A question.
Thank you. Appreciate being here, Administrator Jackson. When you were here last year, and I'd referenced this earlier, I'd asked for a list of concerns with Pennsylvania's law on oil and gas production. I'm disappointed I haven't heard back, and hope that that's something you can still contact people within your agency to be back in touch with us. But since this time, Pennsylvania has also made some changes to regulations. I'm not sure if you've read Pennsylvania's Act 13. It was just passed into law, so you may not have. But it contains a number of provisions in there, including ways to handle violations. It has a requirement that unconventional well operations must have DEP-approved water management plan for water withdrawals, and a whole host of other regulation changes that Governor Corbett signed into law. Now, I would ask then that, as I don't know if you actually had a chance to read that, I hope so, but what concerns me is I'd still like to hear from you with regard to if anything remains as an issue from Pennsylvania. I won't put you on the spot right now to have memorized that, but if you could get back to me. Would you be able to do that, ma'am?
We're happy to. Just keep in mind, sir, we're in the middle of a 2-year study that is specifically to look at the impact of fracking on drinking water.
Yes.
And so what I've said is anything we learn from that study, the first audience will be the states, because they're really on the front line of trying to protect their people and regulate these industries to keep them safe and responsible.
I appreciate that. Well, given that you're still in the middle of a study, a February article this month from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, your agency said you began a multimedia investigation of air, water, and hazardous material impacts, which you'd not previously acknowledged. And in late September, when an on-site testing was done, and according to the paper, it said that you're in the quote, initial stage of possible enforcement action or actions. So I'm concerned that a couple of things. So you're in the middle of enforcement actions, but you have not yet completed a study. And I also question, is there a statute that gives the EPA authority to regulate oil and gas production, or is it water and air? I'm confused here.
Certain aspects of production are regulated under a number of statutes, whether it's the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. general duty clause under the Clean Air Act. There are spill prevention and containment regulations that are separate. So there are a number of statutes. I cannot comment on the validity of the media.
But not specifically to gas production. You're saying it has to do with the water on site or the air on site? That's what you're...
It has to do with the environmental impacts of certain operations that might be associated with the drilling. But the actual drilling and, as you know, the actual injection of fracking fluid are generally exempt from many of the major laws.
As you go through this, do you have petroleum engineers and working on this study for you in reviewing these things in Pennsylvania?
Yes, sir. The study and its scope was peer reviewed. We put together panels. We had public meetings.
I'm aware of that. I just wonder if you have on your own employ petroleum engineers who have some expertise in this area.
We can certainly get you the list of folks, but the study is being done by our Office of Research and Development. So I believe there are engineers of all types involved in the study.
I would appreciate knowing that. As you know, in FY10, Congress directed the EPA to carry out a study on the relationship between hydraulic fracturing and drinking water using a credible approach relies on the best available science as independent sources. Now, I've been looking at your FY13 budget, and yet you want an additional $14 million to expand the scope of your study to cover potential air ecosystems issues. Now, in this study, you spent $1.9 million in FY10, $2.5 million in FY11, $9.7 million in 2012. For 2013, you want to spend another $14 million. Puts the cost of this whole study at $28.1 million and expanded beyond the original scope. I want to comment here. A recent study at Pavilion, Wyoming, linked groundwater contamination to a well site that used hydraulic fracturing. But there's been a number of scientific concerns among them on that. Among them have to do with the pH level of the water involved there. Are you familiar with that question about the pH values in that study?
Generally, yes.
Okay, all right. There wasn't going to be math today, so don't worry on this.
I'm sorry.
But I said there's no math questions involved. But one of the issues here has to do, and I would appreciate you getting back to me on this. But I understand that in the case of drilling, there were some test wells drilled. This was not the actual water wells drilled, but they're test wells drilled by EPA, and so it wasn't actually testing the water there. But there was a concern about a high recorded pH level of 11.5 in these monitoring wells. I'm sorry, it's around there. But the soda ash that's used in the drilling, I'm just sending out some confusing information. The soda ash used in the drilling has a very high pH level, that's 11.5. And I wonder also if you can get back to us, if you're not aware today, if even the process of drilling, your monitoring wells, that chemicals were added in that process which may have influenced that finding.
Yes, sir. I'm happy to. Two things. As far as the study, it really isn't an expansion of the congressionally mandated study. We're going to include additional scientific questions working with USGS, with the Department of Energy. That's in response to the President's call that we not shy away from investing in good science. We believe that will make the natural gas industry more robust if we look to answer these questions. As far as Pavilion, I've spoken to the governor several times. We've agreed to review and move forward together on additional investigation. Certainly the use of some caustic like soda ash could raise pH, but we believe that when you look at the blanks and duplicate samples that our work is valid, but we're also agreeing to move forward collaboratively to take additional samples.
I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. At this time, I recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Capps, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your testimony, Administrator Jackson. I want to begin with a brief comment. I was disappointed with the decision to eliminate Beach Act grants, and I find EPA's justification absurd. Without funding, county environmental health officials will have to drop testing. In San Luis Obispo County, we've seen 11 occasions when conditions were so bad that officials closed a stretch of shoreline to all contact. The possibility of cutbacks is not good news. We can't assume local jurisdictions will be able to replace lost grant funding. EPA needs to partner with our local communities, not leave them out to dry. Now on to questions. Last year, when you appeared before us to discuss the administration's 2012 budget request, you noted that adaptation to changing hydrological conditions is, and I quote, a significant issue faced by the nation's drinking waters and wastewater utilities. Unfortunately, the cost of these adaptation needs is not currently included in EPA's infrastructure replacement cost estimates for water and wastewater systems. And since that time, EPA's budget has further experienced cuts, but data continues to accumulate, demonstrating the scope of adaptation challenges faced by water systems. For example, a report recently released by the Johnson Foundation at Wingspread, American Rivers, and Cirrus concluded that our nation's drinking and wastewater infrastructure is not prepared to deal with extreme weather events, including persistent drought, shifting precipitation patterns, and declining snowpack. More frequent occurrences of these events will strain water systems to previously unknown levels and impose drastic costs on local communities across the country. However, since last year, I've taken steps to address this issue by introducing the Water Infrastructure Resiliency and Sustainability Act. This legislation would offer competitive matching grants to help local water systems build their resiliency to these changing hydrological conditions, and I'm pleased that this legislation enjoys wide support in the water utility community. My question, given these well-documented challenges facing the nation's water and wastewater systems, do you think this type of cooperative approach to promoting infrastructure adaptation and resiliency among federal, state, and local stakeholders can become an effective first step to address this issue?
Thank you, Ms. Capps. Although I can't speak on the specifics of that legislation, I think that you bring up a good point. Adaptation and the issues it's going to mean for our infrastructure are significant and are going to require a collaborative approach in terms of engineers as well as folks who are interested in providing water, but also folks who are interested in lowering costs and in community public health protection.
And is there a structure within the budget to deal with this?
I don't believe so. I don't believe we have anything in the current budget, Ms.
So we'll have to be innovative in figuring out ways to be cooperative in this area.
So we're happy to work with your staff to.
I'm happy to do that too. I want to turn to your work in advancing the Sustainable Communities Initiative, which is something I commend. And I was pleased to see the President again made this an important initiative a priority in his budget. This funding helps empower local communities to plan more sustainable communities with more housing and transportation choices so that families can live close to where they work, shop, and go to school. This dramatically reduces commuting times, which is not only good for economic growth, but also for energy independence. Do you see this type of sustainable development as an effective way for communities to help insulate themselves even from the rising gas prices?
Yes, as communities choose, and it is a voluntary program, but for those communities who are choosing to look at those issues of transportation, energy, water, and efficiency and environment all together, they're finding win-win solutions.
Good. Are there some examples, just for the record, of how this type of development impacts a community's energy independence?
Oh, absolutely. You know, it can be a large city like Philadelphia where we're working with them. I should probably pick one in California. I apologize. But they're in my mind because of a previous question. Or it can be a smaller community or even a rural community who are looking at issues associated with development or potential new development as their economy improves and making choices about locations, transit, roads, siting that would help them be more sustainable over time by cutting their energy use and their carbon footprint.
So as communities are anticipating this kind of planning and development, you offer yourselves as partners available to be on consultation with them as they make these changes?
Yes, it's HUD and DOT and EPA and the technical assistance we can provide along with some meager financial assistance. But of course HUD and DOT in their road planning efforts can be of great assistance and sometimes funding to help these communities maximize increasingly limited dollars.
Thank you very much. I look forward to working with you on it.
Thank you. I would like to remind everyone again that we still don't have a clock, but we do have the lights, and just periodically look up there, and if the red light is going, then your time's up. This time I'd like to recognize a gentleman from Texas, Mr. Burgess, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Administrator Jackson, for being here again. I've got a number of things I want to get through. If I don't get to them all, I will submit questions for the record. I would appreciate a response. We're still waiting on some responses from your last trip here. But we hear from your agency, from yourself, from Gina McCarthy and your agency, how you care so much about people in this country with asthma. And as an asthmatic, I appreciate that concern. But I got to tell you, I mean, the EPA is the one federal agency that's standing between a lot of asthmatics and an over-the-counter asthma treatment, Primatene Mist, that's been available for forever. I get the fact that the Food and Drug Administration plays a role in the approval of the new HFA propellant and Primatene. I get that. But your agency has the ability to provide a waiver so that the existing stock of CFC containing primatene mist could be sold to asthma patients in this country. And it's not a small issue. The prescription HFA containing compound costs about 3 times what the over-the-counter CFC propellant primatene costs. But the big issue is availability. If you get in trouble in the middle of the night and you don't have a prescription, you've got to go to the emergency room. And that really costs patients. So I'm just asking, will you grant a waiver so that existing stock of primatene containing CFC can be sold? It's a yes or no question.
No, sir, we have not granted the waiver.
Will you? Will you grant a waiver so that asthma patients in this country who depend upon this product can at least have the availability of the stuff that's already made? It's in warehouses. If something is going to happen to it at some point, the CFC is not going to stay bottled up forever. Could you not just make that available to patients in this country?
Sir, I'm happy to look into it, but I will not answer yes or no. In 2008, the FDA set out a rule letting folks know, including the makers of primatene mist, that they needed to phase out of the CFC that is depleting.
I got to tell you, I'm so frustrated with the circuitous nature of this. It goes back and forth between your agency and the FDA. I'm just asking for some help here for the patients who are asthma sufferers in this country. You have the ability to provide that help.
There are 19 safe and effective asthma treatment alternatives, though, sir. 19.
Let's move on. I've got some questions about Title 42. You and I have talked about this in the past. Now, are you aware that the Government Accountability Office has recently put out a study, and HHS has put out some new guidelines, an advisory on Title 42 pay. Are you aware of that GAO work in progress?
I have not seen it personally, sir, but thank you.
Well, they put out some advisories, and they have asked that there be a cap placed on the Title 42 positions in their agency. Have you discussed this with anyone at HHS?
I have not personally. I did, when I became administrator, asked to understand our Title 42 hiring process. Congress had raised it as an issue. In FY 2011, I believe we had 17 and hired a total of 5 more.
And these are designed to be temporary employees. Are they temporary employees on your balance sheet?
I believe that they are designed to meet certain needs. We have them mainly as heads of our national labs. Those national centers are state-of-the-art research, and oftentimes we're looking for people with very specialized skills.
But by definition, these are designed to be time-limited, and HHS has now agreed to a cap on Title 42 employees. Are you looking at providing a similar sort of cap in your agency?
We don't have a tremendous number of Title 42 employees, and I'm happy to provide the justification to you, Mr. Burgess.
Well, I've been waiting, again, on some of those questions that we submitted last time, and I will resubmit some today, and I am looking forward to that. Since we have the CFO with you today, Ms. Bennett?
I'm sorry, we have authority for 30 positions, so we do have a cap, Dr. Burgess, I'm sorry. And so we're using 17 out of the 30, which is our cap.
And are you going to adhere to the fact that those are to be temporary or time-limited positions?
I will look into the issue, sir. I will not concede it
here. Clearly, Mr. Chairman, this is the reason why this authorization committee needs to take a greater role in the oversight of the money spent by the Environmental Protection Agency. Let's go. Ms. Bennett was kind enough to be here and talk to some of the issues related to line items in the EPA's spending last year. I'm so glad that she's here today. Last October, I think we had a hearing here, and there was concern because of unobligated funds that were sitting in the EPA's bank account. Just as purely as an example, we had I think we had $15.6 billion. And we've been provided a little bit of granularity from the Office of Management of the Budget on this, but are you going to provide us detail on what you're doing to unwind those unobligated funds. I mean, you're asking for the same amount of money you got last year, and yet the American people look at your budget and see this money just sitting in limbo in your account, and it's hard to justify expending the same amount of money when you've got money sitting there.
Yeah, the vast majority of those unexpended funds, the majority of them are in Superfund balances. They're construction funds, and as you know, when you run a construction account, you have to have the money in place so you can bid the job, complete the job, and you don't always expend it or obligate it on a precise fiscal year
Some are in
schedule.
Superfund, but not all. And again, the level of granularity provided by the CFO, I think, is instructive, but we need more action on that.
The gentleman's time has expired. This time, recognize the gentleman. I forgot to tell you we didn't have a clock, didn't I? This time, I recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Markey, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A little bit of history. Back in 1995, Newt Gingrich took over as Speaker. First thing the Republicans did was attach a rider to the budget each year prohibiting an increase in fuel economy standards. Prohibiting it. 95, 96, 97, 98, 99, year after year. Then George Bush took over as president. They did not add the rider anymore because Bush wasn't going to do it anyway. And so we go all the way to 2007, and you have a case, Massachusetts versus EPA, and you have my language, which is going to increase fuel economy standards to 35 miles per gallon within this decade, and then increase it dramatically beyond, which gives the joint authority to EPA and NHTSA to now announce that the new standard is 54.5 miles per gallon for our country by 2026, which by the year 2030 will back out 3.4 million barrels of oil a day. We're in a mess because the Republicans were prohibiting that increase from 1995 until after they finally lost the Congress. And if they had not prohibited it but put stronger standards on the books, we'd be telling Iran right now, we'd be telling the Saudi Arabians we don't need their oil any more than we need their sands, but they prohibited it. So they get back in power again. It's 2011. What's the first thing they do? They pass legislation through this committee on the House floor, stripping EPA of their authority to look at increases in the efficiency of the vehicles that we drive, of the boats, of the planes, of the trains, of everything. They go right back to business as usual, digging this hole. Violation of the first law of holes, which is when you're in one, stop digging. Okay? So that's the mess, the technological mess that the Republicans have put us into historically. Then we say, we have a strategic petroleum reserve. Let's start to deploy it so we can tell Iran, as they're holding this oil weapon over our head, you know, that we mean business and we're going to be tough going back at you. They say, oh, don't deploy the strategic petroleum reserve. Then they want to pass the Keystone Pipeline bill, and I bring out my amendment on the House floor and say, well, that has to stay in the United States. And they go, oh, no, it doesn't have to stay in the United States. Then we have a vote out on the House floor 2 weeks ago that says that they can drill the oil companies off the coast of New England, Florida, California. And so I have an amendment that says, but that oil and natural gas, it has to stay inside of the United States. And all the Republicans vote, no, it doesn't have to stay in the United States. It can go overseas. This is a dream scenario for Saudi Arabia, for Iran, for these countries. Okay, dream. It's beautiful for the American Petroleum Institute, okay? But it's anything that placates Iran, you know, in terms of what the message is we're sending in terms of the amount of oil that, you know, we're going to say we don't need from them anymore. So let me ask this of you. What would that mean if there was a repeal, Madam Administrator, of your authority to look at how to increase the efficiency of the vehicles which we drive in the United States?
Our estimate of the savings of oil because of the National Clean Cars Program is 12 billion barrels, Mr. Markey.
And what would happen? What would happen to what is the total per day, what does that translate into in terms of per day consumption of oil in the United States?
Now, I actually don't have that number right in front of me, sir, but we know that one of the reasons that we are at the lowest level of imports in recent history is because of the efficiencies of these automobiles, and the Energy Information Administration assumes that our use of oil will continue.
The average consumer today has to spend about 7% of their income on gasoline. Now, if the tough standards stay on the books to increase efficiency, there's a dramatic reduction in the amount of oil that people have to purchase to put into their gasoline tanks over in the years ahead. And that's a big tax break for ordinary consumers if they have to purchase less gasoline at the tank because of the increased efficiency in the vehicles which they drive. What would this do in terms of your ability to be able to protect those consumers from that dramatically higher oil price that they would have to pay?
Without a national standard, we would lose the benefits. We assume those to be $1.7 trillion over the life of the program.
Okay, so from the perspective of this debate, the Republicans want to keep the oil tax breaks $4 billion a year on the books for oil companies, even though they made $137 billion last year, and you can put an infinity sign next to what the oil companies are going to make this year. But those tax breaks stay on the books. They're advocating an expiration of the tax breaks for wind industry this year, which is going to lead to its collapse. And it's all part of an ongoing profile that basically is a rearview mirror view of how powerful America can be technologically, and telling Saudi Arabia and OPEC we don't need their oil any more than we need.
Gentleman's time has expired. This time recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Bill Bray, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Quickly, a gentleman from Massachusetts was giving us a history lesson. I'd like to remind him that in 1995, I introduced a bill that was to eliminate the mandate that ethanol had to be in the fuel stream, and his own state of Massachusetts supported the California reformulated gasoline as cheaper and cleaner than the federal mandated. Every member of the California delegation, every member supported that legislation except for the ranking member of this committee, because the deals that were cut in Washington were more important than energy independence or about clean air. But going back to what was the percentage of the CAFE standard increase have we mandated in the last few years? Total.
Well, we've doubled the fuel economy under President Obama.
In what period of time?
Well, it will be between 2012 and 2025 model year cars.
How much in your budget today, how much is committed to requiring governments to do more traffic management and fuel efficiency through traffic control?
We don't have any requirements on traffic.
So in other words, it's easy for those of us in government to point fingers at the private sector and say, you've got to make your cars more fuel efficient. And we got studies coming out of places like University of Kansas that shows 22.6% of all emissions and fuel consumptions is inappropriate traffic control. Stop signs that could be yield signs. Roundabouts that would replace stop signs and traffic control. But in your budget, you're walking away from the opportunity of reducing fuel consumption and pollution by 22.6%. And because we're focused on mandate on the private sector, but not asking those of us that are in fellow government agencies to clean up our act and stop requiring consumers to stop every 2 blocks because we just find it easier to do that. I mean, my God, ma'am, you can't even get the blinking lights in Congress out here to be turned to amber behind this building. You got to go stop sign just because it's easier for government to say, no, you've got to stop here, rather than being intelligent. Now, don't you think, Administrator, especially coming from your local government background, that isn't it time we ask government to start participating in the answer? Isn't it time that we start requiring the local governments, the states and the counties, to start looking at how we're doing business and start changing the way we're doing it and going to smart traffic management as much as we're requiring the private sector to go to smart cars?
Well, but I think, Mr. Bilbray, that's happening. In the Recovery Act, I've spoken to
Wait a minute, you say it's happening. It's happening voluntarily?
It's happening because local governments are looking at their energy impact and using investments like in the Recovery Act to make investments in smart.
Ma'am, I'm going to stop you right there. City council member I pointed out, he says there's no financial reason for our city to do that. Give us a financial incentive. Pay us to do this. And all I'm saying is, did we pay the auto industries to go to a more fuel efficient, or did we tell them they've got to reduce their emissions and their fuel consumption? And if we do that with the private sector, then damn it, why do we hold cities, counties, and federal government immune from it? Why don't we set the same standard for those of us in government that we're setting on our private sector? And how can you say that we're doing everything we can to have fuel efficiency and clean air when we allow the government to take a free ride on this one?
Sir, I would refer you to the Department of Transportation, who I think in their smart transportation and planning do encourage local governments to put in place ordinance and smart traffic.
Administrator, I've administered the Clean Air Act just like you have. You know, in non-attainment areas, isn't it true that when you allow one group in a non-attainment area to pollute, the other group has to somebody has to offset it, right?
A new source has to offset its emissions.
Well, I'm saying when government is allowed to force cars to pollute, usually it's the stationary sources that take the biggest hit because they're the easiest to regulate, aren't they?
No, sir. I think that
you trying to tell me that mobile sources are as easy to regulate as stationary sources?
Well, we just did. I mean, the National Clean Car Standards are regulation of mobile sources, light-duty vehicles, heavy-duty.
Ma'am, you were in Connecticut, weren't you? Didn't you do the air strategies for Connecticut?
New Jersey, sir.
New Jersey, excuse me. All those little states get mixed up for us out in the West.
You have a big one, sir. Sure.
But I'm sorry. I'll just tell you, I just can't believe anybody that's done air regulation could say that mobile sources are as easy. All I'm saying is you still have a major source of pollution, and it's government. When will we finally, Democrats and Republicans, come together and say we need to lead through example, not point fingers at everybody else? We're talking about spending taxpayers' money, but we're not willing to change regulations that government is operating. Rather than throwing money at the problem, why aren't we getting smarter as government to reduce the emissions and extend the fuel efficiency in our operations? Why can't we do that much? The cities and the counties have too much control?
Gentleman's time.
Well, they're balancing safety considerations, sir. The traffic signals and stop signs for safety, and they're balancing their need to ensure public safety.
Excuse me, I heard that about cars. Excuse me, I heard that about cars for 30 years. The fact that safety meant you have to be fuel inefficient.
Let me just say that I'm trying to be fair, Chairman. We don't have a clock. I've let some people on your side go a minute and a half over. Some people on this side have gone a minute or so over. So we're just trying to be as fair as we can be. At this time, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Butterfield, for 5 minutes.
Let me thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your even-handed leadership of this subcommittee. When I was a trial judge for 15 years back in North Carolina, after a session of cross-examination like this, I would simply tell everybody just to take a deep breath and count to 10. And so I'm certainly going to do that and ask others to do the same. Let me thank you, Administrator, for coming forward today with your budget, and thank you for all that you do for our country. As the President has said now for years, and I'm sure that he tells all of you this every day, that we've got to make some tough choices. We've got to make tough choices in our budgets. And clearly you have given us today a budget that, in my opinion, seeks to protect our communities and promote sound science. And so I support your efforts, and I believe in what you're doing, to say the least. However, on a brief note, I am a little concerned about the impact to critical infrastructure that will be caused by the proposed cut of $359 million from state revolving funds. The Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, and Mr. Waxman spoke to that earlier, has provided states with the authority to give extra assistance in the form of extended loan terms and lower interest rates or principal forgiveness to disadvantaged communities. And I live in a disadvantaged community, and you know that very well. Because of that, the SRF has been an essential source of financing for small and disadvantaged community water systems that are unable to finance infrastructure projects at market rates. But until the passage of the Recovery Act, states had complete discretion to decide whether to exercise their authority and provide disadvantaged communities with such assistance. 14 states had decided not to provide the assistance. An additional 6 states reserved less than 4% of their funds over the life of the program for these disadvantaged communities. Recovery Act funding of the SRF made a significant difference for millions of Americans, and you know that record very well. In fact, according to EPA, Recovery Act funds provided through the Drinking Water SRF brought 693 drinking water systems, serving over 48 million Americans, back into compliance with the Safe Drinking Water Act standards. 48 million Americans got safer water, and at the same time, good-paying construction jobs were created. There is still a significant need for this funding to improve drinking water quality and spur job growth. These cuts will be hard on all water systems, but particularly small and underserved communities who need the funding the most. Question. The budget in brief expresses the intent of the administration to target SRF assistance to small and underserved communities. How will you do that?
It will require us to work with the states, as you know, Mr. Butterfield, and thank you for your comments. I agree that the Recovery Act changed the world for certain communities, and we don't have the same legal authority to direct money. It goes through the states, so we'll have to work through the states to change the prioritization system. We'll do that collaboratively, but in a time of decreasing resources, we have to look at the systems which really could not, through rate increases or any other way, finance these infrastructure improvements.
In the last Congress, this committee passed bipartisan legislation to reauthorize the SRF. That legislation would have required states to provide some additional assistance to disadvantaged communities. Unfortunately, that bill did not become law. States once again have discretion to choose not to provide special assistance to small and rural systems, and cuts in SRF funding may discourage states from providing that assistance because returns on loans made by state funds will become more important. Second question, do you foresee these cuts to the SRF having an impact on the amount of assistance states make available to small and underserved communities?
It likely will, sir. In all honesty, they are revolving funds, so the amount that a state has available in any given year depends on what loans are repaid, so from, how much of the principal they're getting back. But less money, we believe, will potentially impact their ability to make these loans and or grants.
All right, Mr. Chairman, I see the amber light on. I suppose that means we're winding down, so I'm going to yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Butterfield.
Yes.
This time I recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Latta, for 5 minutes of questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Administrator. Thanks for being with us today. If I could talk about ozone for a little bit here. In your fiscal year 2013 budget, and when you're looking down the road, do you intend to propose revisions to the National Ambient Air Quality Standard for ozone? And if not in 2013, what's the EPA's current schedule?
The current schedule, sir, is to make a proposal in calendar year 2013. It will probably be towards the end of the calendar year. So I believe that's fiscal year 2014.
Okay, let me ask this then. Does the EPA expect to propose a rule that was similar to the rule that was withdrawn last year?
Oh, I can't speak to what we'll do in the end of 2013. We're waiting on the science. As you know, we have to wait for a scientific review.
Well, because it's very, very important because, with the rule that was proposed last year and that was withdrawn, the estimated costs out there were between $19 to $90 billion annually. And in a state like Ohio, we would have had a great number of our counties go into noncompliance. So when you're considering these standards, it's very, very important to people like me, who represent 55,000 manufacturing jobs, which is the largest in the state, and just by coincidence, the largest number of manufacturing jobs on this committee, that we have to have some kind of an idea what that sticker price is going to be out there, especially because when I'm home, one of the things I hear from my constituents is what's happening here, especially with the EPA, is the #1 driver of the cost for them back home. So, but you have no idea where you're going to be going with that at this time?
Well, I can't speak to it. I can say that it's proposed. We take public comment on it, so there'll be ample opportunity for folks to see it, comment, and offer
okay, let me just switch gears a little bit then. Looking at your budget, and it says here that you plan on spending about another $830 million more in enforcing environmental laws. It raises a couple of questions. One is, where does the money go that the EPA collects and fines?
Fine money goes into the Treasury, sir.
Goes right back to the Treasury. Okay. Okay. Let me go back to where Dr. Burgess was, if I could, going back into the question about the reuse of deobligated funds. And I assume that as you're here today, that it's really for it's our benefit, your benefit, that there's total transparency in the budget planning, and that we need to have for the EPA in your plans and in your spending. The GAO testified before this committee that EPA reuses a sizable amount of funds that has deobligated from past years, but does not report this reuse in its budget justifications. In 2010, the unreported reuse of funds amounted to $160 million more than the EPA's spending cuts proposed this year. At present, since the EPA is not reporting how much money it plans to deobligate and reuse next year, were you aware that the EPA is not reporting this information?
I'm sorry, sir. I was trying to get background. Please forgive me.
Yeah.
We do report our deobligations in our financial statements, so I'm happy to take a look at the issue. But when we deobligate money, obviously we're reporting that.
Okay. Well, because what the GAO was telling us is that especially with the reuse of these funds being reported to Congress, those EPA budget justifications, that we need to, that's supposed to be reported. So if you get back to us on that in written comment, I'd greatly appreciate that.
Yes, sir. I believe they're reported in our financial reports, but we were happy to get back to you.
Okay. And again, when we're talking about the switching gears real quick here, because I see the clock's on. I'm trying to be cognizant and helpful to the chairman.
The yellow light comes on, and you have a minute left.
Yep, I understand that. Sometimes time's running down. Do you know how much of the money that is grant money for states that have not yet been distributed? Have any idea on that money that's out there?
There are large unobligated balances and unliquidated balances. There are two different things in the state revolving funds. The states, we give the money once a year, I think on time to the states, but then how quickly they draw that money down is a different question. So there are large balances.
Okay, just and real briefly, do you have any idea how much money was budgeted for state grants?
Well, there's a number of grants. The state revolving funds are about $2 billion. We have the categorical grants, which are $1.2 billion. About 40% of our budget goes to state and tribal grants.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My time's expired, and I yield back.
Thank you. At this time, I recognize the gentlelady from Colorado, Ms. DeGette, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And Administrator Jackson, thank you for coming here today to talk to us. As you know, and there's been little discussion about this, we've had great advances in horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing over the last few years, which have enabled us to have oil and gas production in many, many new areas of the United States. And as a consequence, many of us have been hearing from our constituents about issues like impacts on the air, water, and soil quality of hydraulic fracturing. And they want to know whether the local and federal laws and regulations are sufficient to protect their families. And so I want to focus my questioning on the funds proposed in the EPA's fiscal year 2013 budget for understanding and minimizing potential environmental, health, and safety impacts of this really promising shale gas development. So if you can keep your answers brief, I'd appreciate it. I've got a lot of questions. The first question is, do we know for certain whether or not shale gas development through hydraulic fracturing poses an increased risk to human health or the environment over the risks associated with conventional oil and gas development?
Not for certain. That's why we're doing the studies.
Thank you. Is it known for certain whether or not shale gas development through hydraulic fracturing poses no risk to the environment or health?
No, the same answer. That's
okay.
Why we're studying it.
And so what you're doing, you referred to the study, an objective science-based understanding of the potential risks is really going to be the first step for Congress to figure out how we can develop unconventional shale gas resources. So last year, as you know, Congressman Henchy and I requested the EPA to do a study to determine the potential impacts of hydraulic fracturing on drinking water. Now, due to the extent and complexity of these studies, the EPA established quality assurance plans to ensure the validity of the data. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And the study is currently underway, as I understand, with a report on preliminary findings due at the end of this year and another one due in 2014. Is that correct?
Correct.
Now, under your new budget request, the current study will be expanded to address the broader environmental impact of hydraulic fracturing, including ecological impacts as well as ways to minimize any negative impacts, not just the chemical composition of the fracking fluid. Is that right?
That's right. They may be separate studies, but there will be additional studies.
And you think that you need to do that as an agency to get an understanding as to the environmental impacts of hydraulic
Air quality,
fracturing.
water quality, ecosystem impacts are of concern.
Okay. And now, can you comment briefly on the scientific review process for the extended effort that you're talking about, Administrator Jackson?
Well, obviously, we'd be scoping it, and it's all contingent on getting the money in the budget. But we'd work with the USGS. We'd work with the Department of Energy to scope studies that are not redundant. They'll do some as well. And we would look for the same level of rigor as what we're looking for in the studies we're doing.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Murphy asked you about the cost of the study, and I want to give some clarification to those numbers. The EPA budget requests a total of $14 million dedicated to studying shale gas development through hydraulic fracturing. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, of that, $6 million is dedicated to completing the reports promised for 2012 and 2014. Is that correct?
I believe that's correct as well.
And then the $8 million increase will go towards what you just described, better understanding the ecological effects of wastewater discharge and the potential impacts on air quality resulting from hydraulic fracturing. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So I want to point out the total funding of $14 million for the hydraulic fracturing studies comprises 0.169% of EPA's fiscal year 2013 budget. The $14 million is EPA's contribution to a coordinated $45 million effort between the EPA, the Department of Energy, and the U.S. Geological Service. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, can you explain the benefits of coordinating the effort between the USGS and the DOE?
Well, we have overlapping responsibilities, but we also don't want to be stovepiped. We want to ensure that we're only doing one study to address one issue, so we're not doing redundant studies, and we also want to make sure we're looking at issues collaboratively, so we look across the field and are more universal in scope.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Chairman, with respect to hydraulic fracturing, this is something, we have all these new advances in the way that we're doing oil and gas exploration, and certainly for a state like Colorado, it can be very, very positive for domestic energy production and for our economy. But we really don't have a lot of data on the environmental effects of hydraulic fracturing, because while the technique has been around for a long time, these new ways that they're doing it are brand new. And so I really think that this study's important, and I would just continue to urge you, Administrator Jackson, to make sure that the studies that the agency conducts are done with the highest degrees of scientific standards and impartiality. Thank you. I yield back.
This time, I recognize the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Harper, for 5 minutes of questions.
Administrator Jackson, welcome, and good news, you're almost done. I think we're getting close. So you've been very patient. Appreciate your attendance here and your insight as we look at these issues. You know, one of the things that's very important to my state and my district certainly are the technical assistance grant program that Chairman Shimkus referred to earlier. I had filed a bill on that. Some of this language that's in there is of great importance to our state as we look at that, how it affects small communities. And what all I want to do is make sure, I think just follow up on what he said, which was to make sure that the criteria that is set forth by the EPA actually tracks that appropriations language, and we're actually covering all those bases. So if you're agreement, as I understood it, would be to work with him, check with him on those issues to be sure.
This is on the rural water assistance,
Yes.
right, sir? Yes.
Yes. And we just want to make sure we take a double check at that criteria to make sure we're in compliance with that language.
Yes, sir.
Looking at this, and I believe this is a budget hearing. I know we've talked about many other things and things that are here, and glad to have you here too, Ms. Bennett, as we look at these figures. These are difficult times, as you know. And as we look at this, and I know you've discussed tough choices and things that have to be done, but when we look at the overall budget on this, it's difficult for people across the country to say that we've done all that we can on tough choices when the overall budget cut I'm showing is only 1.2%. Is that the correct figure? I'm showing that the budget for this year is $8.344 billion, which is $105 million below the 2012 figure. And I want to make sure I'm using the correct figures. Is that right?
Yes, sir, but I'd be remiss if I didn't, we took a 13% cut in 2011, 2.6 in 2012, so now this is the 1.8. You're correct.
1.2 is what I'm
sorry,
showing.
1.2.
1.2. Have we had, I know we have approximately 17,000 employees. Has there been a reduction or increase in the EPA workforce since you've been there?
It's essentially static. We have had small increases, but we've had no. Excuse me. My CFO tells me that we are down this year from 2012.
All right. Now, when we're looking, I know you're set up with 10 regions across the country. Have you looked, or are you looking at ways to perhaps consolidate? Redirect the mission to where you don't lose what you consider to be effective, but you continue to look at ways to save money?
Yes, sir. I can assure you we've looked at ways to maximize and ensure that we remain effective. Each one of those regional offices deals with several states, and those relationships tend to be extremely important.
We're the environmental education grants. How much is in the budget for that? Are you able to tell me that?
So in the President's 2013 proposal, we've actually proposed to, I think, zero out environmental education grant funding. I can grab you the number for the current year.
But you expect in this it's zeroed out, okay?
Yeah, but because many of the programs do education as a component of what they're doing already, and so those grants we are not proposing to fund this year.
It's unfortunate sometimes when we come in here and when there's a discussion on issues, it seems to be, particularly from some of my friends across the aisle, that they want to, in effect, trash the other party, trash the Republicans. I think it's pretty clear that everybody in this room, Republicans and Democrats, all believe in taking care of the environment, and we all want clean air and clean water. You would agree with that, wouldn't you?
I believe that the American people generally do. I think that I have gone on record as saying that the voting record of this House has been several votes led by the party that's in the majority right now against and to turn back environmental statutes.
And of course, you believe that that's turning back some of the things that you believe in, but are you looking at what the cost is? I know you've received many letters from many business groups, too, that believe that we've gone, that we are actually hurting the economy in the process.
Sir, when we do our regulatory work, we are careful to do analysis of costs, analysis of benefits, analysis of jobs we've added in several cases to try to be sensitive to people's concerns about our rules. But we also get as many letters from citizens who want to ensure that EPA is doing its job to keep the air clean.
Last quick question, yes or no. Do you believe that the Keystone XL pipeline should be approved?
Oh, sir, that's not my jurisdiction. I don't have any personal belief one way or the other.
That's a good non-answer. Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. This time recognize the gentleman from Washington State, Mr. Inslee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Administrator. I wanted to first thank you for your work. I have a new granddaughter, 3-week-old granddaughter, Zoe Ann Inslee, and I don't think there's anybody in this town doing more to make sure that she has clean air to breathe and clean water to drink, and swim in. I just want to thank you for your work. And I want to ask you a question about the RFS 2 proposal in relationship to trying to get cellulosic biofuels into the market. I know this is something you've been wrestling with, and I just wonder if you have any thoughts about how we could help the industry expedite the entry of those products into the market, either by rulemaking or otherwise. Have any thoughts about that?
Well, I do believe that EPA is through most of its required work on the renewable fuel standards, setting the required volumes for various fuels from various feedstocks. We've also processed, and I think are through reviewing a request to increase the amount of ethanol blended into gasoline, the E15 waiver. You know, the actual marketing and of gasoline is beyond simply the scope of our agency. We have labels to ensure that people don't miss fuel. There's lots of work happening at the U.S. Department of Agriculture to encourage not only the current generation of biofuels, but I know the Secretary, he and I have spoken many times about his plan. It's a comprehensive plan for the next generation of biofuels to keep that industry alive and well.
Thank you for your work.
Thank you. And congratulations. That's
Thank
nice
you.
stuff.
This time I'd like to recognize the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Administrator, thank you very much. I'm sure this has been grueling to go through 3 hours of this. First question I have, if I could maybe get through a couple quick questions with yes or no's to the extent that we can, was have you ruled out regulating coal ash as a hazardous substance under subtitle C of RCRA?
We have not made a final rule, so that would have to be a no.
Thank you. The second, with this a notice of intent from Headwaters Resources in filing an action against, and I guess some environmental groups are also doing the reverse. They're also taking an action against the EPA on some of the hazardous waste, perhaps. Can you give us, for the record, a commitment that you'll take this into consideration when, if you were to settle, that you will consider the fact that Headwaters has also put in a concern and that they'll be included in the settlement?
I'm not familiar with the letter, but this is
Okay,
on coal ash.
It was filed in your office on, it was addressed to you on February the 9th. Okay. And it was their notice that they want equal protection under this. So, are you saying you will?
In our regulatory actions, in our rulemaking, we will look at all information presented to us. I think public comment period is closed. We now have a notice of data availability out, and
Okay.
I am aware that environmental groups are suing to try to get us to
The third question is the EPA is apparently in a funding with Vanderbilt University and perhaps others this new LEAF environmental assessment framework program that they're doing down there. I can't find the amount in there that what we're doing. It's from what I understand, that may be an alternative to the T-clips. So if you're looking at that, I'd like to understand how much money you're putting into that.
We will get that for you,
Okay.
sir. I don't have.
And then the last and more importantly has been a question. I don't know whether you're familiar with this report that was presented, indoor air quality, indoor air pollution in California in 2005. Very authoritative document in which it points out much of the problems that we're dealing with air quality as indoors, since we're spending approximately 90% of our time indoors. So when all the folks are talking about asthma attacks, premature deaths, heart attacks, whatever, I think very well could be traced back to their conditions inside, since they're spending 90% of their time indoors. But I don't see anything, I can't find in your budget a priority for where the EPA could be stepping up and really dealing with children. Again, in schools with 56 million children are in classrooms every day, and I don't see a prioritization in your budget for what you're spending in education and mitigation and labeling and things for products and others, so you can help. If California is right, they're saying in their own report it's costing the state of California $45 billion a year. Now, I don't know how the folks on the other side of the aisle keep arguing about all these. I don't know how they can differentiate between this getting sick from indoors versus outdoors. But it's a convenient thing to challenge us on. But I'm curious, what can we do on that? And especially given the fact that you're spending $28 million last year giving grants to foreign governments, instead of using that to help educate our states in ways to mitigate our indoor air quality problems. Can you help explain that some to us?
I'm happy to. The President's budget increases our children and sensitive populations budget by $3 million. It is not true that we gave $28 million to foreign governments in grants last year, and we have a program that works with school districts, many of them underfunded, to try to help them address issues of public health for children. Many of them are not mandatory, so these are voluntary programs. Education is important, as well as things like siting guidelines. We were asked to put forth school siting guidelines and other technical assistance to help for things from radon to asbestos. So that's in addition to partnering with states who are often working as well. And I just have to remind us all that, yes, indoor air quality is very important, but outdoor air quality impacts indoor air quality quite significantly as well. And so we look at air as a whole, not simply one versus the other.
Gentleman's time is expired. Mr. Jackson, one thing that Mr. McKinley brought up and a number of people brought up is the amount of grants that are given by EPA to foreign entities directly or indirectly. I would just ask that you all provide us with a list of those over the last 3 years. Last 3 years. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Jackson, Secretary Jackson, today the D.C. Circuit is hearing oral argument in the greenhouse gas litigation, and that involves the tailoring rule. And in your brief that has been filed on behalf, it indicates in that brief that that there would be a need to hire 230,000 full-time employees, that there would need to be an additional 81,000 PSD permits per year, 6 million Title V permits, and a cost to the EPA of $21 billion on top of the current budget, $21 billion per year. I'm looking at the brief where I get these numbers, and then the sentence right after the paragraphs that lay out these numbers says, based on this analysis, EPA found that applying the literal statutory thresholds on January 2nd, 2011 would, quote, overwhelm the resources of permitting authorities and severely impair the functioning of the programs. You would agree with that assessment, yes or no?
Yes, sir.
And that's why you all have defended the tailoring rule based on a theory that there is a theory of law that says if it's not practical, you don't have to do it. Isn't that correct?
No, sir. If we say if the result is absurd or increases administrative burden where it really can't practically be implemented, then we were giving relief. It's a rule designed to give relief to the.
But wouldn't you agree that the businesses of the United States of America find themselves, when they're looking at cement MACT, boiler MACT, utility MACT, that many of the businesses of the United States of America find themselves in exactly the same position that the EPA finds itself on this case, where you all have said the burdens are too great by our own rules to follow our rules? And don't you think that there ought to be a tailoring act for the job creators of America to assist them in creating jobs for the hardworking taxpayers of America? Don't you agree that that would be good policy, yes or no?
I don't agree with your premise, sir, so I can't agree.
So it's okay to have one standard for the EPA and another standard for business?
No, sir, the standard is not for EPA in the tailoring rules.
All right, now let me go forward. I made my statement. I only have a few minutes, ma'am. I do get passionate about this because my people are losing jobs. And let me say this as well. When we were here earlier this year, and Ms. Bennett was kind enough to be with us, she indicated that some of the money that had already been committed but had not yet been spent, some of which was more than 5 years old, was there because of various reasons, perhaps even other permitting requirements or other requirements by the EPA or other agencies. But she indicated some of those were more than 5 years old. I asked her at the time, well, why wouldn't you all back the ability to move to 5 years for businesses in America? Because they need that, and that's in the bill, Boilermact bill, H.R. 2250. She said at that time that was not her position to make a statement as to whether or not she was supporting the bill or not. So I ask you, because I believe it is within your prerogative, why wouldn't you adopt and accept the fact that the businesses of America can't comply with the time requirements, even if we can argue about regulations? There are numerous businesses in this country that cannot meet the 3-year plus 1 standard currently in the code. Why have we seen nothing from the EPA that says, okay, you know what, maybe we need a longer timeline to get these things accomplished?
Well, Mr. Griffiths, it's not true. You haven't seen anything. EPA is reconsidering the Boilermact rule to give greater clarity, to reduce the cost of compliance.
But, ma'am, I am correct. The EPA is not backing any legislation to change the time limit in the law. Isn't that correct?
That is correct, sir.
Thank you. Let me talk about another subject briefly. You have, I believe that you would agree or that you would feel that the EPA is doing a better job today than it did, say, in 2001?
I don't have any feeling on the subject, sir.
Okay.
I believe we're doing a good job today.
All right. Because I look at these, I have a chart here that says that you all have about 1,000 less employees now than you had then. And I'm wondering if there was ever a study done to show where there's as happens in many cases, a diminishing return on investment, or at some point you just get too many folks and you can't be as efficient. I'm wondering if any study has been done at the EPA of exactly how many employees you need to be most efficient in accomplishing your tasks.
There have been workload studies done in the past, sir, and we can certainly get those to you.
Okay, if you could get those to me, because, you know, look, I know you can go to absurdity. You can't go down to one employee and be more efficient than you are with a certain number of employees, but I do note that it appears you all are doing a lot more with a lot less already, and I'm just wondering where the break point is, because we're trying to find money, and I hope you appreciate that. And then, oh, my time is up. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Griffith. At this time, I recognize Mr. Engel of New York for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know I want to reiterate and mention some of the topics that have been mentioned. I want to emphasize that. But before I do that, I want to thank you for the job that you've done, the excellent job you've done. You're on the hot seat. It's a tough job, but the work that you do is so important. And one of the frustrations that I have had, frankly, with this majority in Congress, is that the attacks on the EPA and the attacks on clean air and water and all these things are very, very frustrating to me, because I believe that the role that you play is such an important role, and that we ought to be facilitating the things that you do rather than impeding them. So I want to thank you personally for the job you've done, and I am glad that your agency is there, and I'm glad that you're doing the work that the American people want us to do. People want clean air and clean water and all these other things, and I just wanted to state that. I wanted to add my voice to Ms. Castor, who spoke about the reduction in the 2013 budget of $359 million for the Clean Water and Drinking Water State Revolving Funds. I hope there might be a way to try to restore some of that money, because my state of New York has received many millions of dollars to protect our watersheds and make upgrades and repairs to our sewer systems, and EPA's most recent drinking water infrastructure needs survey indicates that New York will require $29.7 billion over 20 years to ensure continued delivery of safe public drinking water. So I want to emphasize that, and I hope you can find some way to restore those cuts. Okay, I want to talk about fracking, because that is something in my state that is a hot topic. We have many people who are fearful of fracking. Obviously, we don't want it to contaminate the drinking water or have fracking by the watersheds, and that is a concern that I have. On the other hand, it has the potential to create many jobs in western New York, as it has been doing in Pennsylvania. And I know that you had, I know Mr. Gett and Mr. Green had spoken with you about it with the study. I think the study is a good idea. I think that we have to know what we're dealing with. I think it's important to wean ourselves off of Middle Eastern oil and Venezuelan oil, quite frankly, with countries that don't wish us well. But I do think that the fracking is something that many people remain fearful of, and we need to look at. So I wish you well in your study, and I hope we can have the results of that soon. Finally, I want to mention a topic that hasn't been mentioned, and that is PCBs in schools. Last February, New York City embarked on a 10-year, $700 million plan to replace all the old light ballasts in all New York City schools over the next decade. Could you please explain EPA's role in that remediation project and provide for me an update on its status? And could you also please provide an update on efforts to address window caulking in schools as well?
Certainly, sir. In 2011, EPA inspected New York City schools for leaking. The lighting ballasts were leaking, and they were leaking PCBs. And those inspections found numerous leaking ballasts with PCB concentrations, some exceeding 600,000 parts per million. The city stepped up, announced a plan in 2011 to replace all PCB lighting ballasts in 772 schools. I believe it's part of their capital budget plan to make schools more energy efficient, the lighting being part of that. The city's allocated about $708 million in its budget to implement their plan over 10 years. EPA's reviewed that plan and told city officials that 5 years would be a more reasonable time frame to address the ballast issue as part of the larger plan.
Well, I know 5 years. I know New York lawyers for the public interest have recommended 2 years, and I know things are difficult to be done in 2 years. PCB contamination in our schools, as you know, is widespread and threatens the health of hundreds of thousands of school children, certainly in New York City. And the exposure in children has been found to decrease IQs and increase risks of ADD, and among other things. So would the 10-year timetable, well, okay, I made the point. It's hard without the clock ticking, but again, I hope you'll look into that. And again, I want to emphasize thank you for your very, very good work.
Thank you. This time, I recognize the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Pompeo, for 5 minutes.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here today, Secretary Jackson. I want to talk about enforcement. We haven't had a chance to talk about that at all, and your enforcement policies. You've asked for actually an increase in your budget for the Office of Enforcement and get the name right, Office of Enforcement Compliance. So you've asked for a $33.5 million increase there, and I've heard lots of concerns from my district about enforcement policies at EPA, and I thought I'd do it in the micro today. You'd mentioned something called the general duty of care a little bit earlier in answer to a question that's part of the Clean Air Act. Can you tell me if you have adopted any EPA-wide policies or guidelines with respect to the definitions inside of the Clean Air Act related to the general duty of care?
I'm not aware of any, sir, but we can certainly talk to the Office of Enforcement on that.
There's a term in there called extremely hazardous chemicals, and you have the risk mitigation plans, which are required if certain chemicals are stored at manufacturers or producers. But as I understand your enforcement policy, even if a chemical is not listed as one of those chemicals that requires a risk mitigation plan, you can ding the producer or the manufacturer under this sort of not very well defined general duty of care. Is that correct?
I believe that's right. It happened after Bhopal, I believe, that they added this idea that manufacturers have to be proactive in looking to have that extra duty of care. I believe that's right.
So this is a place I'd love to work with you all. I'd really, and this is Congress's fault. They gave you these really undefined terms and very general authorities and said, hey, you need to put some definition to it. You've chosen not to do that by regulation or by a policy memorandum. So you've left this wide open, and now, whether it's acetone or whatever it may be, producers and warehousemen have no idea which chemicals you may come after them for under this general duty of care standard. I'd love to work with you to develop cleaner standards. Frankly, I'd rather get rid of Section 112R. I think you've got plenty of authority under the RMP program to decide which chemicals are truly dangerous.
Why don't we have our folks talk about that? If there's specific issues or in general, I'm happy to have our folks.
I'd be happy to do that. Do you reward folks inside your agency for performance, for how many fines they get or how successful they are at obtaining injunctive relief by value?
We do track fines and injunctive relief. I think large cases that are very difficult, it would not be unusual for a manager. I used to run an enforcement program at EPA many, many years ago for a manager to note hard work and diligence. But not specifically. You're not tied to how much money you bring into the Treasury or how many actions you take.
And all that money does go to the Treasury. It doesn't. The employees don't get it as an incentive compensation. You don't get it because you've done a good job.
No.
EPA doesn't get it as part of their budget. It just goes back to general revenues for the Treasury. Is that
Penalty
correct?
money and fine money goes back to the Treasury. The exception is the Oil Pollution Act. There's been lots of discussion about that.
Great. I appreciate that. I will tell you that in Region 7, at the end of 2010, there was a press release issued that sounded like, and I'll read it to you. This was from Region 7 on December 6, 2010, and it says, environmental compliance and enforcement activities conducted by Region 7 during FY 2010 sets a new record, securing more than $3 billion in investments in pollution control and cleanup as a result of legal action taken against polluters. It then brags that it collected fully 31% of EPA's fines all across the country. Two thoughts. One, is that the kind of press release you think is appropriate, sort of bragging about how much money you've taken out of the United States economy? Or second, 31% from a single region, Region 7, do you think that suggests there's differential enforcement, or do you think the regions are just that different?
No, enforcement fines are oftentimes somewhat serendipitous. They depend on one large case in one region, could make all the difference. If there's a fine, for example, with respect to the BP incident, that could make one region's fines look huge. In terms of bragging on investment in cleanup and investments in, those are generally injunctive relief, where we require a company not as much to pay the fine, but to do the work to come into compliance. And we think it's important that the American people know that there's an environmental cop on the beat. It deters people from violating, and that's an important part of an enforcement program.
Fair enough. I would suggest that when the agency uses the term polluters, I'd guess that some of those were by agreement. Some of that injunctive limit was probably with agreement with the particular business or individual. Is that probably right?
Yeah, but that agreement came as a result of an enforcement.
Right, and they probably in their agreement said this agreement doesn't indicate any wrongdoing. It simply says we're willing to cooperate with the EPA, and yet you use the term polluters, which is, I will tell you, in Kansas, we view that as a negative term. We think of polluters as being folks that we don't think very highly of, and yet your agency uses that kind of term in a press release for their neutral enforcement powers. And I would just suggest you ought to talk to folks about not using language like that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This time, I recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Cassidy, for 5 minutes.
Hey, Ms. Jackson.
How are you, sir?
You're always well prepared and unflappable. So even though we often disagree, let me just compliment you on just how your kind of whole presence is. So
I'm worried about the other shoe that's about to drop.
There is no other shoe. It is truly a compliment.
Thank you, sir.
The care grants, I don't understand these well, but I am told that care grants which go to community organizations, the science that they generate, or at least the press releases they generate, is not peer-reviewed science. The state's DEQ does not look at it. You do not look at it. But I can tell you they get headlines. And sometimes in our kind of media-driven society, that headline has an impact. So, one, is that true? That when these community groups get grants from EPA, there's nobody at EPA responsible for vetting the validity of their claims? First, is that true?
Well, we certainly don't vet their press releases. We ask them to use sound science, and we expect and hope they will. But because they're community groups, we don't hold them quite to the same standards we might a governmental entity, or I hope ourselves.
Now, I will tell you, now that's a fair statement, but on the other hand, does anybody look at the responsibility of these community groups in general? Are they periodically audited to make sure that the science that they're putting out or the claims they're making are actually justifiable, or are they hyperbole?
I believe, sir, they're more audited to look at their fiscal responsibilities and taking federal
That's a fair
money.
statement, and I can believe that. On the other hand, I will tell you that when people put things out in the press, if it is read, people believe it sometimes, even if there's no validity. Let me just suggest that if we're going to hold you or a state DEQ or an industry group responsible for the validity of their science, these groups should be as well. I mean, they're certainly influencing the debate as much as a major employer would who happens to have an emissions issue. Would you agree with that? Or
I think it's fair that if there are claims being made that someone could ask EPA whether or not we agree with that data. So in general, I see your point, sir.
Okay, thank you. Secondly, the President in the State of the Union speech spoke of natural gas being used as a transportation fuel and of his hope to encourage such. I'm not aware of any initiative, though, that he has so proposed, certainly nothing legislatively. Do you know of of such an initiative?
I don't believe there's a legislative initiative right now. So
and is there an administrative initiative?
I seem to recall that he talked about a corridor in California that could be made to be natural gas friendly, and I thought that was voluntary with the state of California, but I can check on that.
Now, one thing that has been proposed as a use of natural gas is to create methanol from it to use it as a fuel additive. And so I really kind of pursued this because it seemed like it would be a wonderful way to come up with a low-cost, way to supplement oil and gas, particularly with the ratio of cost of natural gas to oil. And I went so far as to meet with people from industry, fairly high in research units at industry. They told me it would take 15 years conservatively for something such as methanol to be thoroughly vetted through EPA's regulations as to being safe for use. And it's not methanol per se, but rather it was the agents to make it miscible within gasoline. Now, that said, and this is someone who's been currently working on ethanol, and so he kind of knows of that which he speaks because this is the process they're going through with ethanol. If we're trying to use our natural gas as another way of transportation fuel, is there any way we can make that less, that is so daunting as to mean it's never going to happen?
Sure. It would be off-putting. Happy to meet with or have my experts, you don't want them to meet with me, but my experts in the fuels group talk to them about methanol in particular. And, of course, natural gas in and of itself without a transformation is, I believe, what the President was more directly addressing in terms of a potential transportation.
Well, but he's done, no offense, I'm not being derogatory, he's just done no initiative on it. So it sounds really great, and I actually think it's great, it's just nothing's happening. Now, the methanol could be a fuel additive much as ethanol is, but again, I'm told that the regulatory process is just, again, so long as to mean it will never happen, which is a potential denied, if you will.
Well, I think it's worth having a discussion with those who are interested in pursuing methanol.
You've been very responsive to me in the past on a certain issue. If you don't mind, I would like to meet with them, just so, frankly, my industry groups are afraid of you.
Are afraid of me?
Well, afraid of your agency. They're afraid they're going to be penalized by regulation if they somewhere will go back. We're tight on time. I will yield back, and I again say you're unflappable and well prepared. I thank you.
We do have one vote on the floor, but 400 people still have not voted. So, Mr. Scalise, I'm recognizing you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the Administrator for coming, and want to specifically thank Administrator Jackson for your support of our efforts to restore the Gulf of Mexico as it relates to dedicating the BP funds to the Gulf Coast states. As you know, we passed a portion of the Restore Act here out of the House just a few days ago, and we're working with our Senate counterparts to try to get the entire piece of legislation, the Restore Act, by truly bipartisan legislation, through the entire process. I don't know if you want to make any comments on the Restore Act, but I want to thank you for your efforts there.
I'll simply say it's extremely important that those resources return to the Gulf of Mexico. So thank you for your leadership.
Thank you. I want to talk about your budget. I know there's been some talk about what the President's proposal is and whether it's a reduction from current level. I wanted to compare, if you look at what we were given, the view over the 4-year period since you had come in. Of course, there was a big spike through the stimulus bill in fiscal year 2010, which would be represent about a 35% increase in your budget, and then it's tailored down a little over the years. But even with the president's budget request, it still would represent about a 9% increase from when you took office. I don't know if want to make sure that these numbers are the same that you're using, because under these numbers that I'm looking at, you started off with about a $7.6 billion budget. You go to an $8.3 billion budget, which represents still a $700 million increase over that 4-year period. Just wanted to point that out, make sure that was an accurate number.
Just two things, or maybe three. We continually increase the amount of money that's going to states and tribes, even in a budget that's down 1.2%. A large part of that big jump you saw was for SRFs, which goes directly to the tribes and states. That was $2 billion, and $475 for Great Lakes. So what's really happened is an erosion of those increases back. So we've heard a lot about infrastructure funding, but
but I just want to point out, as some people are suggesting that there are big cuts. Actually, there's been a $700 million increase over the 4-year period. I don't know how some people characterize that as a cut around this town, but I think that's an increase. It's in fact a 9% increase.
Well, they are cuts, in fact, from prior year budgets, but it is also really important to point out that the agency itself, 40% of our dollars heading straight out the door to state and tribal grant programs. We're preserving those, so we're doing that at the expense of other agency operations.
Right, and and again, when you look at when your agency started your second year, I guess, with a 35% increase, that came at a time when many states and businesses were cutting back their budget. So you just want to keep that into perspective. On the hydraulic fracturing issue, I know my colleague from Texas has brought this up with you. I would strongly encourage your agency to allow the states to do what they've been doing so well for decades, and that is to do state regulation of hydraulic fracturing. I know it's worked very well in Louisiana in protecting not only our aquifers, but allowing for a dramatic increase with this new technology in the amount of natural gas that our country can provide, not only to our states, which we're pretty much self-sufficient on natural gas production in America, but with all these new fines, not only does it provide opportunity for us to pull other vehicles off of gasoline and increase America's energy security, but it's created thousands of new jobs. And so there is a real concern amongst the community in the natural gas industry that EPA is looking at getting into an area where the states have been very successful in regulating that process. So I just wanted to mention that. On a local issue, I know you've worked with Nucor, which has built a plant in South Louisiana. They are currently pending a permit from the EPA, and that one permit alone would equate to about 700 plus jobs. And I wanted to know if you can give me a status of that permit. Do you have any kind of timeline of when that permit could be approved? Because about 750 jobs are waiting on.
I believe we've approved the permit, and then it was there was litigation that was filed. I believe that's correct, Mr. Scalise, but I'll check on that. I seem to recall that we actually issued the greenhouse gas permit for Nucor sometime last year.
I think there was one permit, but there's another permit that they're waiting on right now.
Okay.
It's my understanding. And
All
again,
right, I will check on that.
All right, but I think there may be another one that they're waiting on right now that would be a second part of their expansion, which that alone would be over 700 jobs. So if you could give me a timeline of what the likelihood of approval of that would be. And I know my time's running short, so finally, on refineries, are you planning on regulating greenhouse gases at refineries?
There are no current rules under development on that issue. We have said in the past, as part of our overall greenhouse gas strategy, that the first big source is utilities. Refineries are next, but we are not at this point.
As refineries are next, if you could just keep in mind, a Small Business Administration recently did a study that showed that the average cost per family of regulations as a whole comes out to about $15,000 a year per family for the cost of regulations. And this isn't just your agency, but when I talk to small businesses, many of them cite EPA as the worst offender, in essence, of this $15,000 per family cost. So if you could keep that in mind as you're looking at these additional regulations, I would appreciate it. And thanks for coming, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Gardner of Colorado, you recognize 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you as well, Administrator Jackson, for your time and patience to be with us today. I appreciate that. And a question for you regarding regional haze, and I'm sure you've heard this before from others either on this committee or other committees. Since the Clean Air Act authorizes each state to draft its own state-specific plan, a SIP, to address regional haze. Do you foresee the EPA approving Colorado's SIP, given that it has cross-spectrum support from electric utilities to environmental groups, has been endorsed by Governor Hickenlooper, Democratic governor, has been approved by the split control Colorado legislature, the Speaker of the House, split control, and has the support in a letter that we sent to the EPA of our 2 Democratic senators, our 3 Democratic House members, and 4 Republican House members?
I can't speak yes or no, but I will say this. I'm aware that Colorado's done amazing work on looking at some of its haze issues, and I believe there's some issues on dates for certain units to put on controls versus shut down that I think the region is working very closely with the state on right now.
And I think right now the deadline is March 8th, I believe, is the deadline. Do you know if that's going to be hit or miss at this point?
I don't have it in my notes, sir, but I would be happy to get back to you on that.
Thank you. And has the EPA used health standards to reject the SIPs of New Mexico and North Dakota?
EPA is still working with North Dakota, and I believe a decision is due, if not today, tomorrow. And so we have, on regional haze, the issue is less about health, but visibility. It's about
so you're not using health standards on regional haze?
I'm not aware that we are, but I can certainly check. On North Dakota, I'm more familiar because I've been dealing with that issue very recently with the delegation.
And thank you. And are you familiar with kinesthetic dance movements?
Kinesthetic dance movements. I know what the words may mean, but not. I've never done them.
Kinesthetic learning.
Excuse me?
Kinesthetic learning. Are you familiar with kinesthetic learning?
No, sir, but I'm not a teacher.
Yeah, one of EPA's primary activities is giving grants. Last December, EPA awarded $25,000 to the Repertory Dance Theater in Salt Lake City to educate youth about the impacts on pollution, impacts of air pollution. On EPA's website, there's a document describing what this money will be used for. The project intends to, and this is a quote, the project intends to produce innovative lectures, demonstrations, and movement classes in 10 elementary schools. Kinesthetic learning will be used to examine air quality issues and encourage youth and their families to adopt healthy living practices. What is this program?
You know, I've read about it, and we are reviewing. It's an environmental justice grant program in Utah, as you mentioned. It's with a very well-respected group, a repertory group that uses dance to educate. Apparently, they have a long history of doing this and are quite well-respected. But we are reviewing it at the request of, I think, one of the members.
Why is the EPA giving $25,000 to a dance company?
Well, the Environmental Justice Grant Program is about educating communities about interventions in communities where there's large populations, for example, that may have asthma. I don't know if it's the case here. Self-education is an important part of getting those kids healthy.
I mean, given the testimony that you've talked about, your funding shortages across the government, can you assure us that you're not going to make these kind of grants?
Well, as I said, we're reviewing the program because of when this came to light.
Perhaps we can talk a little bit further about kinesthetic dancing and whether EPA ought to be
I'm
funding
certainly not the expert, but I do think that it's fair to say that we can review the program, and I'll be happy to tell you what the results of that
Your budget proposal says EPA, and I know others have touched on this today, Latta and Burgess have touched on this, it says that EPA would reduce spending by $105 million, but in previous years EPA has reused deobligated funds to do so. If EPA deobligates and reuses funds approaching the $160 million amount like last year, EPA is really not reducing spending at all in 2013, is it?
This came up in an earlier question, Mr. Gardner. You know, we do deobligate funds. We report on those movements of funds, and we're happy to follow up if you have.
Do you report on those before you actually make the expenditure? Is it in the budget justification?
It's in the budget justification. In the financial statements, excuse me, sir.
So, but not in terms of, I believe GAO actually said that EPA, the Congress may want EPA to submit information on recertifications in its budget justification documents. You're not doing this in budget.
We're doing it as part of our regular financial reporting.
So you're telling us that you spend it after you spend it?
I don't know whether it's after or before. I believe what we do is as we.
But would you agree as a matter of principle that we ought to know if you're reobligating funds that we know before you do that?
Well, in general, I think we've worked very well with Congress over years to ensure that we're spending the money as Congress intends. And
so you agree that it's helpful for Congress to know about this use of funds in its justifications?
Sir, I'm telling you that we deobligate money from time to time. I would bet all offices do, and when we do, we report it. We're not trying to hide it.
But we would appreciate getting that beforehand. Do you believe that this actually, deobligating these funds and reusing them actually decreases the need for new budget authority in the relevant accounts?
No, not necessarily, sir.
Do you think this money ought to be returned to the taxpayer? It's de-obligated?
It depends on the issue, sir. I mean, we are living within the budget and obligations that we have, but it depends on the issue.
Gentleman's time's expired. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I would just invite my friend to join me in doing the kinesthetic cha-cha.
When and where?
We got a kinesthetic club in Chicago.
Oh, okay. Ms. Jackson, thanks very much for being with us today. Before I let you go, I want to just ask one additional question. Under the Renewable Fuel Standard Law, EPA is required to publish the required volume obligations for certain fuel categories. And the proposed volume of biomass-based diesel specified in the June 2011 proposed rule omitted from the final rule published in December. So what was there in June for the volume for diesel biomass was not in the final report in December. And I was just curious, is that an oversight or was there some other explanation for that?
Sir, I know I don't have a fact sheet on that. Can we get you an answer to your question after the hearing?
Yeah, I would appreciate that very much if we could get that answer. Thank you again for being with us. We appreciate you and Ms. Bennett taking the time to be here. And with that, the hearing is adjourned, and the record will remain open for 10 days for any additional materials to be submitted.